Abel and Adage were talented pioneers in bringing visual sophistication and state-of-the-art sound quality to the genre of the rock and roll documentary. Adage was an even-tempered giant of a guy with a keen sense of image and story, while Abel was a gregarious personality with a strong command of the latest audio technology. They had shot the Elvis shows with a team of 16mm cameras that allowed them to capture all angles and elements of the concert experience, and wanted to present the images they'd collected across a triple split screen. As early sequences were cut together, it looked like the results were going to be exciting and involving, but the filmmakers were after something more. They hadn't come to the project as dedicated Elvis fans, but had been completely charmed and won over by the man, rather than the star. They had come to realize something that Elvis himself had put into words at a press conference before the wildly triumphant Madison Square Garden shows. The image is one thing, the human being another. And frankly, I think they were surprised by his natural intelligence, his ability to read a person or a situation quickly and deeply. They decided that what the movie needed was Elvis's story in his own words, and they wanted him to sit for an audio-only interview to be used against images in the film. They hoped Elvis might open up and, in discussing his life and career, show the thoughtful, reflective side that they sensed was there but had never been showcased in any past interviews. The Colonel, predictably, was completely against it. Allowing Elvis to talk freely and openly to a running tape machine went against all his showman's instincts. But he didn't tell the filmmakers that he wouldn't allow it, only that he would do nothing to facilitate it. I'm sure he figured that without him setting things up, the interview would never happen. He was wrong. Over a period of weeks, when I had the chance, I talked to Elvis about the film and told him about what I was seeing in the editing room. This wasn't just concert performances on film. It was turning into something important. This documentary felt like it would be a great piece of legacy, and Elvis could be proud to put as much of himself into it as possible. Again, he got it, and, more importantly, he trusted me. The interview was on. One day in late July, he sat in a dressing room on the MGM lot with Abel and Adage, myself, Joe, and Charlie. The room was nothing fancy, but it had a pedigree. It was one of the few dressing rooms reserved for the biggest stars. All others got a trailer out on the lot. This had been Clark Gable's room, and it had been Elvis's when he made his MGM films. Elvis was at a table, facing the filmmakers, and I sat in a director's chair behind them, making eye contact with Elvis over Abel's shoulder. I could see right away that Elvis was a little uncomfortable being on the spot this way, knowing that every word was on the record. So I decided to try to break the ice a bit. "Hey, E," I said, "why don't you tell him about what your daddy said about you being a guitar player?" He laughed a little. "My daddy said, I never saw a guitar player that was worth a damn." Everybody laughed, and the atmosphere in the room loosened up. The filmmakers began handing Elvis some old photographs, asking him to reminisce about some of the images, and he began to relax into a friendly, storytelling mood. He discussed his childhood and his early days as a performer, even the inspiration for his sideburns, Memphis truck drivers. When asked about the screaming reaction of his early fans, he said that the first time it happened, it scared him to death. He didn't know what he'd done to elicit that response and went backstage to ask the manager, "What'd I do? What'd I do?" Elvis said the manager responded, "Whatever it was, go out and do it again." When asked about his current fans, his respect for his audience was obvious. But he also said something that hinted at a more frustrating side of his career. "If I do something good, the fans let me know. If I don't, they let me know that. For a while there was the theory that anything I did would sell. I knew that was not true. It's according to the material. You've got to have good material, whether it's a song or a script or whatever. It's got to be good." The interview stayed easy and conversational, though at times Elvis did not seem interested in delivering the kind of quotable self-examination the filmmakers were after. When they asked how he would describe his early sound, he simply said, "It was good." But when the talk turned to a discussion of Elvis's movies, he was not only forthcoming, he was shockingly honest about the disappointment and frustration he'd felt in Hollywood. When asked how deeply he cared about the quality of his films, he answered, "I cared so much until I became physically ill. I would become violently ill. At a certain stage, I had no say-so in it. I didn't have final approval of the script, which means I couldn't say, this is not good for me. I don't think anyone was consciously trying to harm me. It was just Hollywood's image of me was wrong, and I knew it, and I couldn't say anything about it. I couldn't do anything about it." The pictures got very similar. If something was successful, they'd try to recreate it the next time around. So I'd read the first 4 or 5 pages of it, and I knew that it was just a different name with 12 new songs. The songs were mediocre in most cases. That's what might have made it seem like indifference. But I was never indifferent. I was so concerned until that's all I talked about. It worried me sick. I could tell that Elvis wanted to voice some of these heavier thoughts, things I'd always felt to be true but had never heard him put into words before. I'd been with him on days when the stress of starting another film had made him physically ill, and I'd been there on days when studio representatives rushed to his home to insist that he stay on the work schedule he'd been contracted to. Abel tried to steer the interview toward some of the artistic successes in the movies, like the memorable dance sequence in Jailhouse Rock, but Elvis didn't go for it. He was more interested in speaking to a troubling truth of his movie career. Right from the start, he'd been made false promises. That again and again from Love Me Tender on, he'd been told that he'd get a chance to do some real acting, only to be handed underwritten nice guy roles and songs that existed simply to move along storylines. I didn't know what to do. I just felt that I was obligated a lot of times to things that I didn't fully believe in, and it was very difficult. I had thought they'd give me a chance to show some kind of acting ability or do a very interesting story, he said. But it did not change. It did not change. And so I became very discouraged. They couldn't have paid me no amount of money in the world to make me feel any self-satisfaction inside. Adage seemed a little taken aback at the idea of Elvis feeling so conflicted about his work. "But you still did them. You must have forced yourself." "I had to. I had to," said Elvis. There was an almost eerie hush in the room for a moment. This was not the punchy, upbeat interview the filmmakers had been after, and they weren't sure what to make of it. Elvis, sensing that he'd moved into some disturbing territory, backtracked a bit, pointing out that he was the only one to blame for the course of his career. It was impossible not to sense the Colonel's name hanging in the air, but Elvis wouldn't say a word about him, even when asked directly for a Colonel story. And he pointed out that not all the films were so bad, and that some of them worked as pure escapist entertainment. There was a bit more back and forth, and then, after about 45 minutes, the interview was over. Elvis had been quite candid with Abel and Adage, but I think they left that dressing room at MGM feeling he was more of a mystery than ever. They had gotten Elvis in his own words, but those words didn't quite fit the film that had been shot. They were putting together a celebration of his music and talent, but he'd been most open with them, expressing regret about his career. I thought the interview was powerful enough to be the basis of the film, and would work brilliantly against current footage of Elvis on stage, but only a few lines would make it to the final cut of the film, most notably Vernon's quote about the worthlessness of guitar players. My role in both the montage and interview situations improved my status in Abel and Adage's editing room, and pretty soon I'd moved up from grunt work to some real assistant editing. Working near Scorsese was like taking a master class in the art of filmmaking. He worked frantically, to the point that sometimes you thought he might just explode. But in addition to his amazing eye for striking images, he was brilliant at cutting to music, creating rhythms in the picture that moved with the music to create a powerful whole. I admired his skills, but I didn't get to know the man very well. He was so buried in his work that there wasn't much time for conversation, and when he got up from his editing bay, it was usually to dart straight out the door for one of his therapy sessions. One night, after a long day of editing, we were sitting around on the floor, getting ready to shut the office down, when he surprised me with a direct question. "Jerry, you know what I got?" "No, Marty, what?" I was sure he was going to tell me about some strange medical diagnosis he had just received. "I got That's All Right, Mama," he said, "on Sun, a 78. Elvis went on to another month-long Las Vegas engagement while I continued to work on the film. We were pushing for a November opening, and everything was coming together well. With most of the film cut, the final challenge was coming up with a strong end title sequence, something that would both sum up the film and give some added entertainment to an audience that stuck around for the very end of the credit crawl. Abel and Adage were having a hard time coming up with the right song to use. They struggled with whether to end with an old song or a new one, a ballad or a rocker. But mostly they wanted something that had the right feel, something that could sum up the hour and a half that moviegoers had just spent with Elvis. Pierre Adage asked me to come up with 3 or 4 songs I thought might work. I thought about it for just a moment, and the choice seemed obvious to me. Memories, a ballad Elvis had introduced in the '68 TV special, which was all about taking a bittersweet look at the past. I played it for Bob and Pierre, and they agreed it was perfect. Pierre was excited enough about the song to say, "Jerry, I'm going to put a diamond in your TCB." And better than that, he made me an offer. If I wanted to come into the office over the weekend and try out my own cut for the end sequence, I was welcome to. I told him I'd be there. I felt like a slightly overwhelmed kid in a candy shop facing the editing equipment by myself that weekend. I had the same buzzing mix of excitement and nervousness that I'd felt during my first solo plane flight in Memphis. I didn't think crosswinds could affect a film splice, but I kept the windows closed anyway. I sweated it out at first, getting the feel of the process and slowly matching image to music. After a while, the mechanics of what I was doing started to feel natural, and I felt free to get creative. In the back of my mind, I wanted to impress the hell out of Bob and Pierre, and I wanted to do right by Elvis, but mainly I wanted to create something that I was proud of. There were thousands of feet of film to pull from, but I concentrated on building something that would work as a coda to the film and tell a little story on its own. Here were the moments that tour memories were made of, the moments of laughter backstage, the time spent between band and fans, the moments of anticipation at rehearsals before the show, and the moments of calm on the rolling Greyhound bus afterward. I worked with the flow and rhythm of the music, and found some nice places to let the lyrics match up literally with the images. Over a line about quiet nights, I laid in an image of the band slumbering away on their plane. My sequence ended with what Abel would later say was the most powerful and poignant image the filmmakers had captured. Elvis peering out the window of a limo with a 1,000-mile stare. An image that almost perfectly duplicated the famous image of him peering out a train window back in 1956. It was striking that whatever young Elvis had been looking ahead for out that window back then, he was still looking for now. The following Monday, for the first time in my life, I got to experience the elation of a good review. Pierre and Bob took a look at the end sequence and pronounced it to be perfect. The diamond Pierre had promised never actually turned up, but when the film was released, not a single frame had been changed on my editing to Memories. I stayed on with Abel and Adage for a couple of more projects, including the feature I'd offered my services for, Let the Good Times Roll. Working on that film was almost as satisfying as working on the Elvis film, because it combined great archival birth of rock and roll footage from the 50s with contemporary concert performances by Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, Fats Domino, Little Richard, and others. In some ways, this project felt like the perfect companion piece to Elvis on Tour. The Elvis film showed where my friend and I'd gotten to, but Let the Good Times Roll said everything about where we'd come from. When Bo Diddley said in an interview sequence that he still cooked chicken in his hotel rooms, a habit he'd developed after being turned away from segregated restaurants, I thought about how he might have been treated at Uncle John's little kitchen. As I was cutting film, Elvis was out on the road again, making concert stops that included a weekend of sellout shows in Hawaii. Maybe that's how Elvis punished me. It seemed every time I stepped away, he rubbed it in by heading back to the islands. After spending the holidays in Memphis, he returned to Hawaii to begin 1973 with his biggest show ever, reaching a global television audience with the live satellite broadcast of his Aloha concert. At the end of January, Elvis on Tour surprised all of us by winning the Golden Globe Award for Best Documentary of 1972. With Let the Good Times Roll completed and no immediate follow-up work lined up with Abel and/or Adage, I felt that award was a good way to end my second stint at an editing career. I'd keep my eye out for more film opportunities, but a couple of weeks later, I was back with Elvis as he worked through another Vegas engagement at the Hilton. By most measures, Elvis was as big a success as he'd ever been. He had an award-winning film out, had just played to the largest television audience ever assembled, was continuing to sell out concert appearances, and had a song on the pop charts. Separate Ways made the top 20. And on a personal level, Elvis seemed to have found great happiness with a new romantic interest, Linda Thompson. Linda was a lively, beautiful Memphis girl, a Miss Tennessee, who had made appearances on George Klein's local TV shows and had met Elvis on one of his nights at the Memphian. Linda was an extrovert with a fine sense of humor and was great at bringing out the fun-loving side of Elvis. She fit into the Elvis world very comfortably and was easy to talk to and kid around with. And it was nice to have her around. Linda was, in some ways, a conservative Southern girl, but she wasn't afraid to wear the sexiest outfits imaginable. I can still hear Lamar Fike saying, "Oh, Lord, where's the rest of that dress?" But despite the career successes and the new romance, Elvis's work was starting to take a heavy physical toll on him. He had put on weight again and was often in pain from a variety of ailments. The guy with what had seemed for so long to be a superhuman constitution now turned out to be vulnerable flesh and blood, and during this February engagement he had to cancel several shows due to illness. There was no question that his pain and ailments were real, but some of us began to worry about the treatments he was getting. Dr. Nick tried to keep Elvis's intake of prescription drugs balanced, but Elvis had a way of getting to other doctors to get other prescriptions he thought would help him, and it seemed there wasn't any doctor who would say no to Elvis Presley. I really don't think Elvis wanted to be high, he just wanted to function. He didn't want to step away from his music and tune out. He wanted to keep at what he'd been doing for years, giving his all, doing 2 shows a night, and then bouncing back to do it again the next night. As his body aged and tired, he wanted to find some way to coax more music and more performances out of it, and if that could be done with prescription medication, he wanted it. But now, what had started as a way of managing his problems was turning into a problem itself. My own career seemed to be right where I wanted it, but my personal life was falling apart. Being on the road with Elvis had pulled me apart from Sandy, and in the spring of 1973 I realized that I'd become infatuated with someone else. My new love interest was an L.A. girl who'd been a part of many of the weekends in Palm Springs, and while I didn't know if this had any chance of being a long-term relationship, I knew that my relationship with Sandy couldn't be the same anymore. The more I thought about my situation, the more I hated thinking about myself as just another lousy, unfaithful husband. I knew that, at the very least, I had to be honest with Sandy. So one night, at that little Culver City apartment, I decided to tell her everything. That I'd been untrue, that I thought I loved someone else, that I didn't see any way for us to stay together. It wasn't easy to get the words out. I felt flushed, my heart was pounding, my mouth was dry, and looking into my beautiful wife's eyes, so full of worry, concern, and, still, love, I became physically overwhelmed. I'd barely started speaking when my knees went weak and I suddenly found myself on the floor, taken down by some kind of anxiety-triggered fainting spell. The pain in my bumped head was rivaled only by the guilt I felt over the fact that the woman whose heart I was breaking was now doing everything she could to comfort me. On April 4, 1973, I sat with Elvis, Linda, and some of the guys at the Monovale House to watch the American network broadcast of the Aloha Special. In contrast to the state of mind Elvis had been in when I watched the rough cut of the '68 special with him, he was in a great, fun mood. I think the big difference was that in watching Aloha, he knew that the concert itself had already been a success. He'd already heard the applause of a live crowd, and he was hearing it again on TV. Knowing that he'd already pleased his fans, he could relax and enjoy the show himself. The good mood lasted a few days, and it had him feeling energetic enough that he decided to accept an invitation to check out a karate tournament that Ed Parker had organized in San Francisco. Parker had some phenomenal karate abilities and a powerful personality to match, and he and Elvis had connected with a real friendship. I liked and admired Parker, too, and briefly also studied karate with him. I had felt honored that, at no charge, I was receiving instruction from such a master, but I moved on when I began to feel that we were spending more time talking about Elvis than working on our karate forms. Elvis wanted a close group of friends to travel with him to attend Parker's tournament. Linda, Joe, Charlie Hodge, Patsy, and Gigi Gamble, Master Ree, and myself. All our spirits lifted as we made all the required preparations, chartering a plane, lining up limos, reserving hotel rooms. The spirits stayed high on the flight to San Francisco, but in the limo on the way to the hotel, we passed the venue where the tournament was going to be held, and I saw something that I knew was going to shatter the mood. Across the auditorium marquee, in great big letters, it said, "Elvis Presley in person." This was a legal problem. The contract for an upcoming Lake Tahoe appearance stipulated that Elvis was not supposed to be promoted within a 500-mile radius in the weeks before the event. But more to the point, this was a violation of the loyalty that was so important to Elvis. Elvis thought he had accepted an informal invitation to his friend's tournament, and he was happy to support Parker in that way. But he had no interest being part of the event's promotion. Once Elvis got to the hotel, I headed back to the venue and insisted that Parker's associate Dave Hebler get up on a ladder and take Elvis's name off the marquee. This violated all local labor union regulations, but it got done. By the time I got back to the hotel, Joe had already chartered a flight back to Los Angeles. This incident, in a small way, illustrates how Elvis's fame could wear down his spirit. He wanted to have a fun getaway weekend, and wanted to pursue his passionate interest in karate. But instead of being able to attend as simply a friend or a guest, he saw himself used as a name that would sell tickets. Elvis was having some trouble keeping himself healthy and in shape, and I was still terribly conflicted about my extramarital romance. But despite our personal problems, I hadn't ever felt that there was a problem between us. Over the course of some of our Palm Springs weekends, however, I detected a strain in our friendship that I couldn't explain. When a group of us sat and talked, Elvis seemed to go out of his way not to make any eye contact with me. He'd laugh with the other guys, but when we talked, it felt perfunctory, a basic exchange of information. At first, I tried not to think too much about it, but after a while, it was impossible not to be aware of the chill between us. A week after the San Francisco trip, we were out in Palm Springs again, and for the first time in a while, just he and I sat together in the living room. Conversation was a little awkward, and it seemed that something was really bothering him. Finally, he said, "Jerry, there's something I've got to tell you." What he'd told me was that he'd slept with my girlfriend. It was a one-night fling between them, on a Palm Springs night when I'd fallen asleep early. Something that had just happened. I didn't care about the details. I was furious and stunned. As tangled together as our lives had become, this was a horrible crossing of boundaries. It hurt like hell that the guy who had done so much for me could do something so awful to me. It was extremely rare for Elvis to apologize about anything, but he stood there fumbling for an explanation, telling me, "It never happened before, and it'll never happen again." As angry as I was, I couldn't help thinking of what I would have done if I had heard about this some other way. I looked him in the eye and said, "Thank God I heard it from you and not from anybody else." I could tell he was embarrassed, and I was furious, but the truth was that he'd had a fling with a woman I was having an affair with. There wasn't any high moral ground for anyone to take, and it didn't sound like he'd had to work too hard at a seduction, The fling had happened between two willing parties. Within a couple of days, all my anger had turned into a feeling of emptiness. I'd related to Elvis songs on a personal level before, but now I had the awful feeling I was stuck in some lines from one of his heaviest ballads from the 50s. When you find your sweetheart in the arms of your best friend, brother, that's when your heartaches begin. I didn't think the incident had to mark the end of my affair with the girlfriend, though in fact it did, but I knew for certain that this romantic mess was just unacceptable, even in the midst of the crazy lives we were living. This wasn't any kind of fun. It just felt sick and depressing. By the end of May, I was standing in a Glendale apartment, helping Sandy pack up for her flight back to Hawaii. She'd been accepting of my unfaithfulness, was willing to try to work things out, and had thought that maybe a move would help us start with a clean slate. An editor from Paramount I'd gotten close with was leaving his apartment to buy a house, so we moved in. But it didn't help. We tried to set up a new life in the new rooms, but I couldn't shake the old guilt and confusion. Sandy's middle name was Lilinoy, a Polynesian name meaning goddess of the mist of the mountains, and I had always thought that perfectly captured her natural beauty and purity. But I had let that mist drift away for no good reason. I had broken a good woman's heart, and watching her pack her simple belongings into a few cardboard boxes, it broke my heart to think just how little she'd gotten out of our time together. Elvis and I were standing in the meditation garden at Graceland, drinking iced tea to fight off the heat of a June evening. The Palm Springs incident had brought us up to the edge of what was acceptable within our friendship, but once the hurt and anger had burned out for me, the episode was over. Nobody in that situation came out looking good, and I had no desire to be bitter toward a friend who was sincerely sorry. Now we had a few weeks off between strings of concert dates, and were back to spending days at Graceland and nights at the Memphian. "Colonel got me a deal," Elvis said. "A whole lot of money, and I don't have to do a damn thing." In all the years I knew him, Elvis hardly ever talked about specifics of the business side of his career, but he seemed excited to do so this day. The deal was a big one. The Colonel had brokered a lump sum, $5.4 million buyout of Elvis's rights to artist royalty payments for all the recordings he had made up to that point. At the time, his excitement was at least partially justified. The payment figure was huge, and in the days before golden oldies and classic rock were hot radio formats, it was hard to imagine how Elvis's back catalog would ever generate that much money in royalties. Elvis's recordings had already been repackaged and resold so many times already, it didn't seem likely that there was much more profit to be wrung from them. Standing in the garden, I tried to be happy for Elvis, too, but there was something sad and final about cashing in all that great music. Sure, it was a lot of money for Elvis, but I didn't feel like I could possibly put one big price tag on Dewey Phillips playing That's All Right and Hound Dog at Ellis Auditorium, and I Was the One at the stand, and watching the performance of How Great Thou Art, and feeling the goosebumps during If I Can Dream. His music was a soundtrack to my life, and to lives all over the world. It didn't feel right to total it up in any lump sum, even $5.4 million. My mist of the mountains was gone, and Elvis's music was gone. There was no way we could think of ourselves as a couple of North Memphis kids anymore. We were grown men, living lives that were wonderful in so many regards, but lives that were not immune to frustration, disappointment, and pain. In a couple of weeks, we'd be back on the road, hitting city after city again. But beyond the tour schedule, I couldn't tell what the future was supposed to look like. Chapter 12. Black Belt Blues. In all my years with Elvis, I never witnessed him go through any elaborate vocal warm-ups before he sang. He'd keep his voice irrigated by washing out his throat with hot salt water, but before a performance, You never heard him singing scales or bellowing me-me-me's. He would have been as bored with that kind of exercise as he was with sit-ups. He was a natural talent who simply drew upon his natural gifts whenever he hit the stage. The amazing thing was that even with all the stress and strain of the road, and with all the trouble he was having staying physically healthy, the voice only got stronger. The more he worked in Vegas and out on the road, the more that instrument of his became both more powerful and more nuanced, and he continued to challenge himself by taking on vocally demanding material such as Bridge Over Troubled Water, An American Trilogy, and My Way. On a good performance night, when Elvis was on and the band was cooking, you could still get goosebumps hearing him hit the high notes, or hearing him put his heart into one of the ballads. But not every night could be a good night, and it was becoming evident that there was something wrong in Elvis's world. He still liked to see himself as the hero of the comic books, the Superman or Captain Marvel who could take care of all problems and keep everybody happy. And generally he was always able to be exactly that, a rock-solid presence that we could all depend on. Even when he stumbled, all of us around him understood that we were leading extraordinary lives because of one man's talents and generosity. His moods could shift, and his timing could drive you crazy, but you always believed that Elvis would be there for you. If anyone could pull off playing Captain Marvel, it was him. But even a comic book hero has to have new adventures to keep his powers at their peak, and as time went on, and Elvis settled into the routine of Las Vegas engagements and concert tours, his world became as squared off and contained as the panels of a comic page. Hotel suite, showroom, plane, limo, stage. Repeat. There were weeks and months in which that was all any of us saw of the world around us. For a guy who had once jumped off roller coasters for a laugh, and who had once been able to karate kick a pack of cigarettes out of an opponent's shirt pocket, the confinement of the good life Elvis was leading started to feel like a burden. And for a guy who had put together a huge private library of works that explored spirituality, consciousness, and the meaning of life, the routine of his days must have started to feel empty. The strain on him was obvious. At a Las Vegas show in early 1973, a guy from a table in the front of the showroom climbed up on stage to get to Elvis. Elvis was facing the band, and when the guy came up behind him, Elvis quickly took him down with a hard reverse kick to the midsection. An understandable reaction for an exposed public figure who had received more than one serious death threat. When a second guy from the first one's table started to get up on stage, I automatically reacted as a bodyguard, rushing from the wings to pick him up and hurl him back down on his table. Red and some of the players from the band got a hold of two others who had come up, and pretty soon hotel security had whisked the four stage rushers out of the showroom. The chaos and confusion were over in a minute or two, and Elvis got back to his performance. From the reports we got after the show, none of these men had criminal records, and it seemed likely that they hadn't meant any real harm to Elvis. The first guy had done something stupid, and the others had probably thought they were coming to their friend's defense. Whether they were fans or not didn't matter to us. Elvis had been hurt in the past by over-enthusiastic fans, and this time we'd all done the most basic part of our job, protecting Elvis. But after the show, up in his suite, Elvis worked himself into an increasingly agitated state. He wouldn't accept that these guys were just dumb or rowdy or both. Not only did he insist that they had been out to do him serious harm, he came to the conclusion that they had been sent by Mike Stone, a karate instructor Priscilla had become romantically involved with. Joe, Lamar, Red, Sonny, Linda, and I were all there, and the idea didn't seem very believable to any of us. But we were more taken aback by the ferocity of Elvis's anger as he ranted and raged about Stone. We'd seen him angry before, but this time Elvis seemed truly out of control. Nobody was sure if he knew exactly how wild he sounded to us. I think all of us were aware that Elvis needed a way to vent his emotions, and Stone was the perfect target for all the anger and guilt Elvis felt over his failed marriage. Also, if Priscilla's new romance might have been an affront to his sense of manhood, it probably hurt even more that Stone was a top-ranked karate master in peak physical condition. As much as karate was still a passionate hobby for Elvis, he had slipped out of practice, and there wasn't much question that in any kind of match of karate skills, Stone would easily defeat him. All of Elvis's bottled-up frustrations and disappointments were now focused on Stone, and while his theory sounded irrational and his rage was overblown, it seemed like maybe this was just what he needed to work the turmoil out of his system. He didn't have a therapist to talk things out with. He wasn't going to cry on my shoulder, and certainly not on Red's. If he needed to rage around the room, so be it. Also, you could never discount the fact that Elvis was a performer, and while his anger and hurt were real, on some level he was giving us a masterful rendition of the heartbroken husband. All of that we could handle, but as Elvis raged on, the relief never came. He pushed further and further, until he came to a decision that scared the hell out of all of us. He decided that he wanted Mike Stone dead. It was a losing battle to try to change Elvis's mind about anything while he was in this kind of state, and we'd all been in situations where Elvis had talked big about something that he knew and you knew he wasn't going to follow through on. The next day, however, when all of us gathered back in Elvis's suite for a 5 p.m. breakfast, he was still going on about his desire to have a contract taken out on Mike Stone. Nobody could quite get a read on Elvis. Maybe he was still the actor playing the part. Maybe he wanted to know just how far he could push our loyalty. Maybe he really was in such a state of despair that he wasn't thinking clearly. It was a very uncomfortable breakfast table to be sitting at. I felt bad for Linda, who wanted to give Elvis her love and support, but who was starting to get worn down by his unpredictability. All of us had always felt we'd do anything to protect Elvis from any and all outside forces, but now I had the sick feeling that maybe we needed to protect him from himself. The more Elvis talked about Stone, the more Red looked like he was going to explode. Finally, Red got up and left the table, heading off into the kitchen to make a phone call. He returned a few minutes later, went straight to where Elvis was sitting, and whispered something in his ear. We knew then that Red had made the call. I'd learned later that Red, very much against his will, had already made a contact for Elvis, and had found out that $10,000 would get the dirty job done. When he whispered to Elvis at the table, it was the moment of truth. If Elvis gave the okay, the hit would be carried out. At the words from Red, Elvis immediately went pale. Suddenly we saw not the raging actor, but the Elvis we all knew who, in so many situations, chose to be the nice guy rather than the tough guy. He did know how crazy he'd been talking, and he knew that his words had taken us right up to the edge of a terrifying cliff. He wasn't going to take us over it. "Well, that's a little heavy," he told Red. "Let's just leave it alone for a while." Elvis had conquered Las Vegas, but it was impossible to be the conquering hero at every single show. To fight off the boredom of being on that same stage every night, Elvis began to talk to the audience a great deal, cracking jokes, telling stories, and generally speaking freely about whatever was on his mind. It was a jolt to the guys. We'd heard him talk that way around our dinner tables or down in the TV room at Graceland, but never up on stage. Priscilla, who still attended some of the shows, would later say that she was shocked at how open he'd become on stage about his private thoughts. There were many nights when the audience loved seeing a looser, talkative Elvis having fun on stage, but there were nights when the talk and the jokes made the music suffer, and some audiences left the shows obviously disappointed. On one night of the fall 1973 engagement at the Hilton, he had a table of people up front at the early show who responded enthusiastically to his running commentary between songs. As the show progressed, Elvis directed more and more of his performance to that one particular table, until he was almost fully engaged in private conversation with that group and hardly singing at all. By the middle of the show, audience members in the back of the showroom who felt they weren't getting what they'd paid for began leaving. Elvis had used those natural talents of his to entertain millions of fans by this point, and it was an awful shock to see him lose an audience's interest. It was even more shocking to see a sight I never thought I'd see: people walking out on an Elvis Presley show. Joe looked as upset as I felt, and we agreed that the situation had to be addressed. Our job was not to tell Elvis he was great no matter what he did. As his friends, we felt we had to be honest with him, and we wouldn't be worth much as employees or friends if we backed away from telling him a difficult truth. When Red and Sonny joined us backstage, it was clear that they were just as bothered by what they'd seen, and the especially dark scowl on Lamar's face let us know the way he felt. We decided that when Elvis went downstairs to his dressing room, we'd have a sit-down meeting with him. It wasn't unusual for Elvis to sit at the dressing room table with us for a few minutes after the show before he began to change out of his wardrobe. He'd ask us how the show went, and usually we'd relay to him what we thought were the highlights of the night, and we'd give him a rundown on any technical problems or unusual occurrences. He sat with us again this time and looked to be in a great mood. The stage lights may have blinded him to the back of the showroom, so as far as he knew, he had done a great job of connecting with his fans. "How was the show?" he asked. Lamar, who never shied away from putting things in the bluntest of terms, spoke up first. "You know, Elvis," Lamar said, "about 300 people walked out tonight." Elvis tried to laugh it off, as if Lamar didn't know what he was talking about. But what came out of him was a forced, hollow laugh. "The people up in front enjoyed it," he said. I tried coming at it from a less confrontational approach. "Of course they did, E. They had the star of the show paying attention to them all night. But what about everybody else?" Elvis's eyes went cold and his smile disappeared. I think he knew that if we felt strongly enough about his performance to become critics, there had to be a problem. But he wasn't going to hash it out with us. His expression got tighter and he got very quiet. After a moment, he said, "Get the Colonel." Whatever went on between them, the shows were better for a while. Of course, Elvis wasn't going to put on better shows because the Colonel told him to. He was going to put on better shows because that's what felt right to him. But on the last night of the engagement, he again began to indulge in some on-stage jokes and pranks, even singing "What Now, My Love," as he kicked around on a bed that had been rolled out on stage. The audience was completely with him this night, and enjoyed the fun. But Elvis also had a point to make that he felt was serious. He told the audience that the Hilton was about to fire his favorite waiter, who had prepared so many great meals up in his suite, and he didn't understand how the hotel could do such a disservice to such a good, hard-working person. He talked disapprovingly of the hotel management, and his remarks started to carry the emotion of a social crusader standing up for the oppressed little guy. His critique didn't stop when the music started. He got a few further digs in by twisting some lyrics to include off-color anti-Hilton lines. The Colonel thought he had gotten things under control, but was now outraged. He prided himself on his business relationships, and now, publicly, Elvis had embarrassed him with one of his most important business associates. Not only did he think Elvis's comments were unprofessional, he had reason to take them personally. The Colonel had come to consider the hotel's owner, Baron Hilton, as a personal friend, and he felt that Hilton had gone out of his way to accommodate every request made on Elvis's behalf. For the first time in their partnership, the Colonel was in the position of being humiliated by Elvis. The Colonel was down in the dressing room almost immediately, and he and Elvis went alone into a small private area behind a closed door. All we heard were loud, angry voices. When they emerged, neither looked happy, and nothing seemed settled. But the Colonel went up to his room, and Elvis and the rest of us went up to the suite. Usually, we'd all get together for a relaxed celebration after a final show, but this night, Elvis seemed distracted. He had sung well and left his audiences satisfied that night, but it seemed that he was working over whatever had gone on between him and the Colonel. Things stayed quiet in the suite, and, after a while, Elvis said the words again, "Get the Colonel." The Colonel hadn't calmed down from the earlier encounter, and he was also unhappy about being called out of bed at that late hour. He charged into the room like an angry bull elephant. Right away, the two faced off. This was another scene that none of us thought we'd ever see. For so long, the relationship between the Colonel and Elvis had been a strange, complicated dance in which they rarely dealt with each other directly. You never heard them discussing business, and you rarely witnessed them expressing raw emotion toward each other. But here they were, going right at each other, not seeming to care at all that there was a room full of witnesses. Elvis was angry with the way the Colonel had talked to him after the show, and he was angry that the Colonel seemed to think it was more important to defend the Hilton than to side with him. But mainly he was angry over the Colonel's lack of interest in getting an overseas tour together. We had seen a raging Elvis, but now he was focused and intent, laying out his points forcefully. The Colonel responded angrily in the same loud, gruff voice that had terrified so many of his own staff, but Elvis stayed strong. He wasn't going to be talked out of his demands by the Colonel's bluster. The Colonel talked about all that the Hilton had done for Elvis, how Elvis was being ungrateful. Elvis responded that he did appreciate the way he'd been treated in the Hilton showroom, but that wasn't the point. The bigger question was, when was he going to get out of that showroom? Why hadn't the Colonel done a damn thing to make an international engagement happen? Apparently Elvis had already spoken about his ideas for a karate film with the Colonel, because that became a part of the escalating argument too. Elvis felt the Colonel had brushed off the film idea without any thought toward making it happen. Elvis didn't put it in so many words, but his complaint was clear. He wanted to make some kind of artistic stretch, but the Colonel couldn't see past bottom line and business as usual. The Colonel's tone indicated that he had no confidence in Elvis's abilities to handle the business of filmmaking, and I think he may have undercut Elvis out of self-interest. What Elvis saw as professional growth, the Colonel saw as a threat. I still had some sympathy for the position the Colonel was in. To his way of thinking, he had made tremendous things happen for Elvis. The strength and smarts and all the deals he had made for Elvis couldn't be disputed, but he didn't ever seem to fully understand that Elvis wasn't going to measure himself in profits made. He had creative desires that needed to be nurtured and fulfilled. The language of creativity was a foreign one to the Colonel, though, and this showdown had been a long time coming. The two went back to the issue of overseas touring, and the argument finally came to its climax. The Colonel shouted, "If you want to go over there, you'll do it without me." Without hesitating, Elvis shot back, "That's just what I was thinking. You're fired." There was a stunned silence in the room as the Colonel stormed to the door, pausing only to shout out a final point. "If you're going to fire me, you're going to have to pay me what you owe me." I didn't think the night could get any stranger, but when I finally got back to my room, I got a call from the Colonel requesting me to come to his room down on the 4th floor. There I saw a sight that would have been comic under any other circumstances. The Colonel was in his pajamas and robe, with his reading glasses down at the end of his nose, furiously pecking away on a typewriter that seemed old-fashioned even then. He looked like a character out of a Dickens novel, the embittered, vengeful schoolmaster. He'd been at work drawing up a to-the-penny accounting of everything he felt Elvis owed him, and would owe him as contracts that the Colonel had negotiated were paid off. The Colonel had sheets and sheets of figures worked out, all of which tallied up what Elvis was required to pay him if he wanted to walk away from their partnership. Whatever anger or hurt the Colonel felt was simply being channeled into hard, cold business. It just seemed sad to me that he was playing the kind of hardball with Elvis that he normally played on Elvis's behalf. When the Colonel had his papers in order, he handed them to me to deliver to Elvis. This was one of the most unpleasant tasks I carried out in all my years with Elvis, mainly because of the mixed emotions it brought up. I had always wanted to see Elvis's creativity and artistic ambitions fully encouraged and supported. I wanted him to tour overseas, and I wanted him to make his karate film. But I also knew how hard the Colonel had worked for Elvis, and I'd often wondered if anyone less than the Colonel could have handled this powerful, unique talent. Over several days, the tempers of that night settled into an uncomfortable silence. Vernon began to worry about the consequences of the split, wondering how they would ever pay off the Colonel and whether they really could get along without him. Elvis had meant every word he said, but he wasn't happy about dealing with the continuing fallout. The Colonel took a snowman's approach to the situation. He made a play for sympathy, sending messages through the room service waiters that he was ill and looking quite sickly. The Colonel had a few reasons not to feel so well. By now, all of us were aware that he was a flamboyant and reckless gambler. Although he would squeeze every possible dollar out of business deals, he thought nothing of dropping thousands of dollars in one night at the casino. A kind of fever gripped him when he gambled. I once saw his good friend and associate George Parkhill crumple over right beside the Colonel at a roulette table, the victim of a stroke. As casino security put Parkhill in a wheelchair and sped him away for medical assistance, the Colonel's eyes never left the game. It was a losing night, and nothing was going to break his concentration. It was hard to tell exactly how much money the Colonel was throwing around night after night. He always played with unmarked chips. But the way he played, there was no way he was coming out ahead. Elvis turned to karate to work off the frustration over the standoff, flying in Kong Ree from Memphis. I can still picture Master Ree hopping up and down on the couch as he and Elvis used the suite's living room as a dojo. And when they kicked and punched through all the wooden demonstration boards Master Ree had brought with him, they began breaking up the furniture. The situation would eventually resolve itself more quietly than it had begun, but not before Elvis had made a real effort at working without the Colonel. He had Lamar Fike contact Tom Hewlett about booking some road dates, but Tom had been brought into the Elvis world by the Colonel and wouldn't work against him. Elvis felt the one thing he could do for himself was go out and tour, and tried to follow through, but no one he contacted wanted to step into a manager's role. I think Tom and whoever else Elvis spoke to must have realized that there was really only one person strong enough to successfully manage Elvis Presley: the Colonel. In the end, no legal action was taken to sever the partnership between Elvis and the Colonel, and within a couple of weeks, Elvis had moved on to Palm Springs, and the Colonel was overseeing negotiations over the completion of Elvis's next RCA album. But Joe and I wouldn't be around for any of that. Elvis had promised to send Joe and me on a European vacation, a trip that he thought would help us clear our heads after having gone through divorces. Days after the blowout with the Colonel, we told Elvis that, considering what was happening, we were canceling the trip to stay with him. He wouldn't hear of it. "We've been through a rough engagement," he told us, "and you guys deserve it even more. You're going to go." I got excited about the trip and was looking forward to a mix of high culture and carefree fun. I was ready for both after some of the heavy times over the last year, but I could sense that Joe wasn't quite ready for this kind of escape. The wounds of his divorce were too fresh, and his split with Joni weighed heavily on him. That said, Joe was a solid traveling companion and proved to be an expert driver on European roads. Over 3 weeks, we made our way through Greece, Italy, Belgium, France, and England. We got to see the Vatican, the Louvre, and the Statue of David in Florence. We discovered the pleasures of French wine and Belgian ale. On nights, when Joe was not up for exploring a city, I went out by myself. In Innsbruck, Austria, I found myself alone in an elevator with Mick Jagger. I said hello, thinking I'd tell him how much Elvis had dug the Stones' early covers of American blues tunes. But he ignored me. And for the 20 or 30 seconds in which we stood just inches away from each other, made no acknowledgment at all that there was another human being in his vicinity. It didn't spoil my night. I just stepped out of the elevator thinking, screw you, Mick. Joe and I ended up in London, spending time with James Darren, Moondoggy of the Gidget films, and his wife, Evie, who were friends of Joe's. I took the opportunity to upgrade my wardrobe with several shopping trips to King's Row and Carnaby Street. The whole trip was just what Elvis had wanted for us, a great escape. I hadn't realized quite how claustrophobic our lives had become until I got over to Europe. I almost felt as if I'd been holding my breath for months and was now finally breathing again. Even Joe was loosening up a little by the end of the trip. We were refocused and re-energized, and we were going to need that energy, because back in the U.S., things were only getting heavier. After Sandy and I had split up, Elvis had offered me a room in the Monovale house, which I gladly accepted. I was at that house on October 9, 1973, when Elvis and Vernon headed to a courthouse in Santa Monica so that he and Priscilla could finalize the arrangements of their divorce. There's a well-known photograph of Elvis and Priscilla leaving the courthouse that day, in which they are walking arm in arm. That shot says a lot about the relationship between the two. Even after going through a divorce, there was still a love there that they both felt. It was obviously a hard time emotionally for Elvis, and all of us around him wanted to be as supportive and understanding as we could. But less than a week after the divorce proceedings, back in Memphis, something we'd all feared finally happened. Elvis suffered a physical collapse. He'd been having breathing troubles at Graceland that Linda Thompson felt were serious enough to warrant calling in Dr. Nick. After a couple of days of monitoring Elvis at the house, the doctor felt his situation was critical enough to check him into Baptist Hospital. As much as Elvis trusted his personal doctors, he hated the idea of hospitals. To make him more comfortable there, Sonny, Alstrada, and I took on the odd task of preparing a room in an isolated wing of the hospital as though it were the bedroom in the suite at the top of the Las Vegas Hilton. The windows were blacked out with aluminum foil, phone lines were set up, special arrangements were made for the food that Elvis would want, and an extra bed was brought in so that Linda could stay in the room with him. A room directly across from Elvis's was reserved so that Sonny and I could take turns spending the night at the hospital. There was something awful and scary about watching a guy who had once been such a perfect physical specimen just fall apart. Elvis was undeniably overweight now, and had respiratory problems, intestinal ailments, liver dysfunction, and early-stage glaucoma, all of which had been induced or exacerbated by his work schedule and his overuse of prescription medications. I had to admit that getting him checked into the hospital, I also felt a sense of relief. Maybe a hospital stay was what it was going to take to wake him up and get him strong again. The doctors at the hospital were puzzled by some strange bruises on Elvis's body, which he said were from acupuncture treatments he received in Los Angeles. Months before, my back had gotten extremely sore, a lingering condition from my football injuries and motorcycle accident. Elvis had insisted that his acupuncturist could take care of the pain, and promptly took me not to the doctor's office, but to his home in Beverly Hills. I didn't know anything about acupuncture. Elvis was again ahead of his time in embracing this form of treatment. But I was willing to give anything a try to be able to stand up straight. Obviously, I couldn't see exactly what the doctor did to my lower back, but after a half-hour session, I walked out of there feeling great. The doctors at Baptist couldn't figure out how acupuncture needles could leave such bruises, and Dr. Nick tracked down the acupuncturist to make some inquiries about his procedure. It turned out that this doctor was helping the acupuncture process along by administering shots of Demerol, a powerful painkiller. Suddenly I understood how my back pain had disappeared. The doctors at the hospital realized that in addition to having his other ailments treated, Elvis was going to have to be carefully weaned off a doctor-created opiate addiction. We knew that it wasn't going to be enough simply to treat Elvis's physical problems. His psychological dependency on his medications had to be treated too, if he was truly going to get well. But this was a touchy area. Elvis needed to maintain his dignity, and no one was sure how he would react to any attempt to get inside his head. One of the team of doctors treating Elvis was Dr. David Knott, a drug addiction specialist. Joe, Vernon, and I talked with Dr. Nick, who consulted with the doctor. It was decided that Dr. Knott would give Elvis all the treatment he felt was necessary, but he would be presented to Elvis as a liver specialist. Even in his diminished state, though, Elvis was a sharp guy. I was in his room one day when Dr. Knott came by, talked to Elvis a bit, checked some charts, and then left. "You know," Elvis said calmly, Dr. Knott's a psychiatrist." Elvis did get well. He got off the medicines that weren't doing him any good. He lost weight, he started sleeping better, and he even started eating better, though it was hard for the cooks at Graceland not to want to spoil their patient by serving him his favorite dishes. After a couple of months of rest and recuperation, he looked good, and had better energy than any of us had seen in a while. He was back for a 2-week engagement at the Hilton in January of 1974, and this time the shows were strong and exciting. The gatherings in Elvis's suite after the show were upbeat too, and he was the host to some remarkable mixes of people. I remember one night up in the suite, Elvis decided to give Liza Minnelli a complete beginner's guide to karate. A small group of us moved to Elvis's private bedroom, where I became Liza's practice partner, while Elvis provided the instruction. Liza was game, and handling her kicks and punches was a lot of fun. But what made the night even more memorable was that the small group watching the lesson included Chubby Checker, famous for dancing the twist, and Linda Lovelace, famous for doing what she did in Deep Throat. Linda was there with her boyfriend, David Winters, who had worked as a film choreographer for Elvis. Much later that night, Linda and David were arrested at the Dunes Hotel on drug possession charges. It seemed clear that the couple had been set up and were being harassed because of Linda's notoriety, at a time when Vegas had become interested in cleaning up its image. They didn't know who to turn to, so they called Elvis. He offered to post bond for them, but the charges were dropped before that was necessary. By March, we were out on the road for the first of 4 national tours that year. When Elvis was in good form, it was easy for good feelings to trickle down to the rest of us, and as we all went back out on the road, I realized that I was falling in love again. The Sweet Inspirations, Elvis's trio of female backup singers, were comprised of Myrna Smith, Sylvia Shemwell, and Estelle Brown. Cissy Houston, Whitney's mother, was part of the group at Elvis's 1969 Las Vegas engagement. Any of the Sweets could have been remarkable lead singers on their own, but I thought Myrna had a phenomenal talent. I also thought she was gorgeous, and I loved watching her on stage. For a long time, I didn't know what to say to Myrna, but any chance I could, I engaged in some low-key flirting. We were both shy enough, though, that I don't think we would have ever gotten past the flirting stage if it weren't for Sylvia Shemwell. I was spending more and more time around the suites on the road, and I guess Sylvia could tell how much of a crush I had on Myrna. One night I was talking to the singers in their dressing room when Sylvia said, "Hey, Jerry, if you're not going to ask me out, why don't you take Myrna out?" That was all the ice-breaking I needed. I'll never forget the look of surprise on Elvis's face when I told him I was going to date Myrna. He didn't make any attempt to sugarcoat his reaction. "She won't go out with you." The way he said it, it sounded like there was a part he was leaving unsaid. She wouldn't go out with me. Elvis had an extremely special relationship with the Sweet Inspirations. He was with them in their dressing room after almost every show, and I think he opened up to them in ways that he didn't with anybody else. I know Elvis was also attracted to Myrna, but he valued her much more as a friend than as a potential romantic partner. He may have also been a little intimidated by her. Myrna would tell me later that the one time she and Elvis danced together at a party, she could feel him trembling. In the summer of '73, we'd had some interesting transportation on tour. Elvis chartered Hugh Hefner's Playboy jet, the DC-9 Big Bunny, as his tour plane. With my marriage over, I'd actually had some romantic liaisons with a bunny attendant, but given a chance to live a life of debauchery, I always preferred to go with my romantic streak. Falling in love always had more appeal than just falling into bed. And as Myrna and I began to spend more time together, my crush quickly blossomed into sweet love. Myrna and I began really dating, going out for dinners and going to see shows together on nights we weren't working with Elvis. Vernon's marriage to Dee Stanley was over, and he had just begun a romance with a nurse from Denver named Sandy Miller. Myrna and I double-dated with the couple the very first time they went out together. We all went to a Diana Ross show. It was rare for Elvis to allow little Lisa to go out without him, but he allowed Myrna and me to take her out on another of our dates. We attended a Jackson 5 concert at the Sahara in Lake Tahoe a day after Elvis had ended his engagement there. And after the show, I introduced 5-year-old Lisa to a teenage Michael Jackson. Myrna and I got serious very quickly. When she wasn't working with Elvis, she spent a lot of time at her home in Newark, New Jersey. I decided that when she did come out to Los Angeles, I wanted her to be able to stay with me. I remembered how concerned the Colonel had been about living arrangements when Sandy and I lived with Elvis and Priscilla as unmarried couples. It seemed to me that to be with Myrna, the best thing to do was to move out of Elvis's house and get my own place. But when I told Elvis that I was going to start searching for an apartment, he almost looked hurt. "You got a place at my house. What's wrong with that?" "Well, Myrna's going to be staying with me out here," I said. "I just didn't want to make any trouble for you with the fans." "What are you talking about?" I had fallen in love with Myrna because she was beautiful and wonderful, but it had occurred to me that at the Monovale house, we'd be driving past a group of fans at the gate every day. The fact that an unmarried white guy and black woman were living with Elvis might create complications for him. There are some fans that might have a problem with Myrna and me being together." "Myrna's my friend," he said, "and I don't have a problem with it." He insisted I forget about apartment shopping. When Myrna came to L.A., she stayed at the Monovale house. There was never a problem. Elvis had been way ahead of the pop culture wave when it came to karate, but now karate was everywhere. Billy Jack had been a sleeper hit in 1971, and in 1973, Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon had kicked off massive mainstream interest in the martial arts. Kung Fu was a huge hit on television, and by the end of 1974, Kung Fu fighting would be at the top of the pop charts. As a film buff and a karate devotee, Elvis had become almost obsessed with seeing the martial arts films that came out of Tokyo and Hong Kong, along with the American exploitation and blaxploitation films that were picking up on the martial arts trend. When we were in L.A., we'd often head out to a little theater in Santa Monica that screened these films. Some of them were brilliantly surreal. A lot of them were just plain awful. But Elvis always found something in them worth studying. And despite the lack of support he had gotten from the Colonel on the subject, he was still very interested in putting together his own karate film. He and I had many conversations about what this film might be, and he got most excited about the idea of producing and starring in a film that would mix serious drama and action with a hip sense of humor, similar to Dean Martin's Matt Helm or James Coburn's Flint movies. At the same time, he was talking to Ed Parker about putting together an all-star martial arts team to compete in international tournaments and possibly serve as the subject of a karate documentary. The more we talked, the more Elvis sounded like he really wanted to make something happen. And so he was very receptive when I pointed out that we had an old fraternity contact that might help get a production started. Rick Husky, my Arkansas State fraternity brother, and Elvis's honorary brother, had gone on to become a very successful television writer and producer, with credits that included The Mod Squad, The Rookies, and The Streets of San Francisco. Rick and I had gotten close again in L.A., often going out to nightclubs together. And Rick had never stopped being an Elvis fan. He had been to several shows in Las Vegas. I made the arrangements, and Rick came up to Elvis's house to have a meeting with him and Ed Parker, but right away we ran into a problem of creative differences. Rick liked Elvis's original idea of a Matt Helm or Flint style, and felt that with the right story we could come up with a movie that might do for Elvis what From Here to Eternity had done for Frank Sinatra. But Ed Parker had been selling Elvis hard on the idea of the documentary, and now that's what Elvis seemed to be leaning toward. Looking back, I think that even though the dramatic film had the chance to be everything Elvis had always wanted in his films, he also knew his limitations at the time. He knew he was out of shape, and he knew what would be demanded of him as the star of the film. The documentary, in which he would serve as a guide, instructor, and narrator, must have started to look like an easier option. At the house, Rick kept trying to proceed as if this were the same kind of story meeting he'd been at for all his other projects. He'd built a successful career taking the ideas discussed at meetings like this and steering them toward becoming finished projects. But Elvis wasn't much of a meeting guy. He dismissed the from here to eternity comparison and let Parker do most of the pitching of the documentary idea. Unfortunately, Parker's idea of pitching was mainly to demonstrate karate moves. At the end of the meeting, I could tell that Rick was frustrated. I went out with Rick that night, and by then he was down and depressed. He saw a great opportunity for Elvis in a dramatic karate film, but didn't think he'd been given a chance to make his case. He didn't give up, though. Shortly after the meeting, he put together a 30-page treatment for the film he had in mind. Elvis would be an ex-CIA agent running a karate school who sets out on a mission to avenge the death of a close friend done in by drug dealers. Rick got it to me, and I carefully placed the treatment on Elvis's bed at the Monavale house, where I was sure he'd pick it up and read it. But Rick and I never heard a word about it from Elvis. He'd made up his mind. He wanted to put together that all-star team and move forward with the documentary. I may have felt bad that our involvement with Rick hadn't worked out, and that Elvis had decided against making the kind of film that I thought would be better for him professionally and commercially. But those kinds of feelings were quickly erased by another decision Elvis made. He was going to executive produce the documentary, a position that would give him final say on all aspects of the production. And he wanted me to be the film's hands-on, day-to-day co-executive producer. We were going to make the movie together. When I worked on Elvis on Tour, I was happy to have the chance to edit a film about Elvis. Now I was actually going to produce a film with him. Being a creative partner with him on something this big really was incredibly exciting. And it meant a lot that, after all the difficulties he was going through, he obviously had a respect for the work I'd done away from him, and, more importantly, a real faith in our friendship.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.
Rick Husky and I had been spending a lot of nights out at the Candy Store, a private nightclub in Beverly Hills. There he introduced me to Ron Smith, a successful young entrepreneur who was running a modeling agency at the time. Ron invited me to a big party he was throwing for the agency, and at the party I found myself standing next to a large, unmistakably athletic guest, Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt had no reason to talk to me, and I couldn't think of much to say to him. I was aware of his reputation in the press as a gruff, unfriendly personality, but we both sat down at a little table set away from the center of the party. We'd been there a minute or two when a couple of short, extremely non-athletic guys came over and told us that we were sitting at their table and they wanted it back. The request seemed both rude and absurd. Maybe they didn't know about the Golden Gloves in my past, but who asks a muscular 7-footer to get out of his seat? I looked at Wilt. He looked at me, and we both started laughing. We gave the guys their table, and as we stepped back toward the party, we bumped into Ron, who officially introduced us. We talked for a while, and then Wilt asked me if I felt like getting out of there. I did. And about a half hour later, Wilt and I were sitting at Theodore's coffee shop on Santa Monica Boulevard, eating hamburgers, drinking milkshakes, and laughing it up like a couple of old buddies. At the end of the night, he said he wanted to have me up to his place sometime for dinner. He gave me his phone number, and I gave him my answering service number. The next night, I was out with Priscilla, Lisa, and Joni Esposito for a belated celebration of Lisa's 6th birthday at one of her favorite restaurants, the Luau. I felt privileged to be a part of the family celebration, and I was a little surprised when Joe Stellini, the maitre d', came to the table and told me that I had a phone call. It was Wilt. This was the night he wanted to have me up to his place. He had his private chef at work on a special dinner for us and wanted to know how soon I could be there. I told Wilt that I was already having dinner, and I told him who I was having dinner with. It wasn't something I could dash away from. Wilt's advice? Don't eat too much, and come on up to my place for a late dinner. Well, that was easy enough to say yes to. Wilt had done the designing and engineering of his home, which had been featured in all kinds of designer magazines. It was sort of a modern marvel, with a retractable roof that opened up to allow stargazing from the master bedroom, and TVs that would rise out of the floor at the touch of a button. Wilt gave me a tour of the place and showed off all the furnishings, which that night included a couple of beautiful young women. Wilt hadn't invited me to be part of some larger get-together. We were it. Wilt, me, the girls, and the chef. I wasn't all that interested in the girls. I was, after all, crazy about Myrna, but it was a heck of a dinner party to be a part of. Before I left that night, I told Wilt that Elvis had an engagement at the Sahara in Lake Tahoe coming up, and that I wanted to have Wilt there as my guest. Early in the run at the Sahara, I got the call. Wilt was on his way up to Tahoe. I made all the arrangements with the hotel so that he'd be well taken care of. Just before the show, I let Elvis know Wilt was going to be out there and that he'd had me over to his house. I asked if I could bring him backstage to say hello after the show. Elvis seemed indifferent to meeting with Wilt. The show was a strong one. Elvis was in great voice and delivered the music with great energy. About halfway through the show, Elvis stopped the band to speak to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "there's a man in the audience tonight who many a Saturday I've spent watching on TV. I've seen him wearing a rubber band around his wrist, and he wears a headband up around his hair. But what you notice most about this man when you watch him is that he is a true champion. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Basketball, Wilt Chamberlain." Wilt stood up and got his own ovation from the crowd. It was an unusual moment, because while Elvis might introduce a celebrity or a notable from the stage, he rarely did it with that kind of feeling and detail. I had no idea how Elvis knew about the rubber band Wilt always wore when he played. After the show, I thanked Elvis. I told him it was a great introduction, and that I was surprised to learn he was such a basketball fan. "I'm a fan of anyone who's the best at what they do," he said. Not only did Elvis welcome Wilt backstage, he asked him to come up to his suite. There, while the rest of us had our usual after-show gathering, Elvis and Wilt sat on a couch together in deep discussion, going one-on-one until about 5 in the morning. The karate documentary began to move forward. We were going to film the travels of the all-star team that Elvis and Ed Parker assembled, which featured a number of national champions and renowned martial arts specialists. Parker began setting up tournaments for the team in the U.S. and Europe, while I worked out the filmmaking details with staff we'd brought on board, producer George Waite and director Bob Hammer. In between some of the tournament footage would be some more interesting work. Elvis would be on screen himself, demonstrating moves and explaining the history, principles, and spiritual elements of karate. We'd film him watching some of the tournament scenes, and he'd point out what you were seeing, serving as a fight commentator. In some of the extra demonstration scenes, he wanted to include another collection of karate notables, including Kang Rhee and national champions Jim Kelly, Joe Louis, and Bill Wallace. Elvis himself wrote up a scene for the end of the film in which he'd stand on a wind-blown hilltop in tight close-up, performing the Lord's Prayer in Native American Sign Language, a gesture he thought would emphasize the spirit of inclusiveness in the martial arts. As the camera panned back by way of a helicopter shot, we'd see that Elvis was not alone on the hill. He was surrounded by all kinds of masters of the arts. The large group would be spread across the hillside, filling the frame, and from our distant perspective we would see them begin to go through some precision karate forms led by Elvis. The words, "The Beginning," would mark the end of the film. The filming of the team began without a problem, but I found that it was hard to get the all-important Elvis scenes. He worked in Las Vegas in August and toured in October, and when he had time off, I tried to set up the shoots with him. But the period of good health he'd had after his hospitalization was slipping away, and he was often in a state of exhaustion again. He always wanted to put the shoot off a week so that he could lose 5 or 10 pounds, though I could see he really needed to lose maybe 10 or 15 pounds. It was hard for him to step away from his draining performance schedule and give the film the attention he wanted to. Finally, on the spur of the moment one night, He arranged to have some footage of himself shot at a karate school in Memphis. The effort was well-intentioned, but the results weren't very good as either quality filmmaking or serious karate. I began to worry that if we didn't maintain some discipline and direction through the production process, the film might spin out of control. I also began to worry that too many pressures were again going to take their toll on Elvis. Elvis was worried too. During his hospitalization, he had gotten off all his medications and had tried to get his body to function without the sleeping pills he had relied on for so long. Doctors hoped that without the medications, he'd get physically tired enough to reset his body clock. It didn't happen. In the hospital, Elvis had wanted to get well. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for any pain relief or sleep medication. But he couldn't sleep. The most vivid image I have of him during that hospital stay is of him sitting on the edge of his bed, rocking back and forth, waiting and waiting for his body to let itself rest. After 72 hours of uncomfortable wakefulness, his body was under such stress that the doctors gave him a sedative. Since then, he'd been using medication under the watch of Dr. Nick, but both Nick and Elvis realized that in trying to keep up with the unbending demands of travel days and performances, his reliance on medications was getting out of control again. In November, Elvis decided to try to get thin and rested using a new therapy he'd heard about, a sleep diet that could reset his metabolism and his sleep cycles through a 3-week regimen of liquid nourishment and carefully monitored sedatives. This therapy had been created by Dr. Elias Ghanem, a Las Vegas doctor to the stars who had previously treated Elvis during some of his Hilton engagements. In mid-November, Elvis moved into the upstairs bedroom of Ghanem's home. Linda Thompson and Elvis still had a strong relationship, but Linda had been smart enough to realize that she was going to need some breaks from the Elvis lifestyle. She was also very aware of the fact that when she wasn't around, Elvis might be with someone else. When Elvis came to Dr. Ghanem's house, he was accompanied by Sheila Ryan. Sheila was a shy, pretty young girl with a deceptive independent streak, and she and Elvis had become involved during his August Las Vegas run. For additional moral support, Elvis also had Charlie Hodge staying nearby at the Hilton. I went to Dr. Ghanem's in mid-November to give Elvis what I thought was a very encouraging report on the documentary. I sat with him in his bedroom and laid out papers and checkbooks and told him what had been shot and how the production was doing. I told him we now had enough footage that it was time to take the next step. We needed a post-production facility. I had found a space on Hollywood and Vine that would work as a business office and editing studio, and I told him what we needed to do to get in there and get working. I'd already secured the services of Burt Lovett, a top editor who had done some great work on Elvis on Tour. The movie was really happening, and contrary to all the Colonel's dismissive comments about Elvis's ability to handle business, we were sticking to our budget. Elvis was right on top of everything I was telling him, asking all the questions a sharp executive producer would, and seeming satisfied with the progress that had been made on the film. It was after midnight when we finished talking, and I told Elvis I was going to head back to the Hilton where I was staying, but Elvis casually asked me to stick around downstairs at Dr. Ghanem's house for a while. I killed some time down there, and about a half hour later, Charlie Hodge came down and told me that Elvis wanted to talk to me again. I went into his bedroom and walked over to the side of the bed where he was sitting up. He looked very serious and was focusing on me hard, like he was really taking note of me. Without saying anything, he handed me a piece of paper. It was a check for an enormous sum made out to me. It didn't match up with any of the film budget items we had talked about, and I thought he must have misunderstood something I told him. "Elvis, what's this?" "Jerry, you've been working hard for me. I'm buying you that house you've been talking about." As comfortable as I'd been at Montevale, I had still felt like I wanted to get my own place, and I knew I wouldn't be able to stay at Montevale much longer anyway. Elvis had let us know he intended to sell it. Rick Husky was getting ready to sell his home, a great hillside house off Sunset Boulevard, and I'd been doing everything I could to scrape together a down payment. But banks were taking a dim view of my unusual entertainment industry employment record, and it didn't look like I was going to be able to make the deal. The check Elvis handed me wasn't for a down payment. It was to buy Rick's house outright. While I'd been downstairs, Elvis had called Rick, waking him up, and negotiated the deal. Elvis was buying me a house. My hands started shaking so badly that I dropped the check. Elvis, this is too much. He leaned forward with a smile, picked up the check, and put it back in my hands. How many friends buy you a house? I felt more connected to Elvis than I ever had. But back at the hotel, a thought crossed my mind. The Colonel was not particularly sympathetic to matters of the heart, and it was possible he'd find a way to quash this deal and cancel out Elvis's gift, just the way he had rendered my personal public relations business cards useless. This gift meant enough to me and to Elvis that I decided to take action to prevent any possibility of the Colonel's interference. I got a security guard from the Hilton to accompany me to a bank, where I cashed the check. I then flew back to Los Angeles with a suitcase full of money. I can say from experience that when you travel with a carry-on full of cash, you don't sleep on the plane. The deal with Rick happened quickly. He told me that in his conversation with Elvis, Elvis had asked if Rick wanted him to send some guys over to help him move out. Rick had asked, only half-jokingly, if he could finish his night's sleep there before worrying about moving. Rick did let me move in while all the paperwork was being handled, and I'd been in the house a couple of days when a housewarming party showed up. Elvis arrived with Joe Esposito, Dean Nikopoulos, and Linda Thompson. He was going to spend Thanksgiving with Linda in Palm Springs. Elvis loved the place as much as I did. Set high up on the side of a canyon, the house had a spectacular view of Hollywood and the city beyond, which Elvis said reminded him of his Hillcrest house. I enjoyed the warm conversation with everybody, and it occurred to me that for the first time in my life, I was the host and Elvis was the guest. When he and I had a moment alone out on the home's beautiful balcony, I thanked him again. And as he stared out at the spectacular view of the twinkling city below us, looking absolutely at home here at my new place, I thought again about something he had told me a few days before at his house. He had said, "You know, I drove the other guys crazy when I bought that for you. But Jerry, your mother died when you were a year old. You never had a home. I wanted to be the one to give it to you." Chapter 13. Beckett. None of us were sure whether or not Dr. Ghanem's therapy accomplished anything, but the time Elvis spent at his house gave him a chance for deep rest that he found hard to get anywhere else. In December, he checked back in with Ghanem for a second round of the sleep diet. This time it was Linda Thompson and Charlie Hodge who accompanied him. I flew back out in the middle of the month to give Elvis another report, but before I made that trip, I got my first unscheduled visitor at my new home. The doorbell rang. I went to answer it, and I found myself facing a mountain of muscle. "Rick Husky?" the mountain asked. "No, I'm a friend of his. He used to live here. It's my place now." "Oh, sorry to bother you," the mountain said. "Just tell him Jim Brown came by." Jim Brown, the record-setting former running back with the NFL's Cleveland Browns, had been Elvis's favorite football player. Elvis admired Brown's hard-charging running style, but what he really loved was the way Brown would get up and walk back to a huddle after he'd been tackled. Brown never ran back to a huddle. He walked like he owned the field. And no matter how hard he was taken down, he got up and walked back to his team with the same confident, unhurried strides. It was a walk I'd seen Elvis emulate time and time again in our football games. Brown had moved on from football to pursue a film career, and apparently wanted to meet with Rick Husky to discuss some kind of film or television project. It was another one of those moments where all I could do was shake my head. I'm standing in a house Elvis Presley bought me, turning Jim Brown from my front door. And as Brown walked away, I got to see up close and in person that same nonchalant swagger that Elvis loved so much. I'd been going to our film production office at Hollywood and Vine every day to work with the editors, and I was feeling confident that the karate documentary was progressing smoothly. The team that Ed Parker had put together performed incredibly well, and footage shot at tournaments in England and France looked great. I felt that the film had every chance of becoming an exciting feature documentary. What was taking shape in the office matched up very well with Elvis's vision for the project. The Colonel had put his objections to the project in writing, pointing out that if a business plan he had designed was not strictly adhered to, he wanted to be completely absolved from any involvement with the film. So much for a manager's vote of confidence. The Colonel continued to insinuate that Elvis had no idea what he was doing getting involved in film production. But Elvis was a bright guy who had already made 33 films. He had picked up a thing or two about movie making along the way. I flew out to Las Vegas, checked into the Hilton again, and headed over to Ghanem's house to meet with Elvis. I gave him a report on all the finances and told him things were going well. It was another positive meeting. Elvis didn't look like he had lost any weight, but he had good color and looked healthy. This time, after we talked, I did head straight back to the hotel and went to sleep pretty quickly. A couple of hours later, I was woken up by the phone. "Jerry?" The voice sounded so weak I almost didn't recognize it. "Elvis? Can you help me?" "What's wrong, E?" "I can't move." "Who's there?" "Nobody." I got over to Ghanem's house as fast as I could. Up in the bedroom, Elvis was lying face down on the floor. Linda was there, but hadn't been able to lift him up. "Jerry, my legs won't work." Elvis had gotten up to go to the bathroom, had fallen, and then found that he didn't have the strength or coordination to get himself back up. I picked him up and got him into bed and as comfortable as possible. His breathing was all right, and he wasn't in any pain. He just felt he couldn't control his legs. We didn't talk about calling an ambulance. We were already at a doctor's house, but we needed to get a hold of the doctor. Ghanem was out somewhere and wasn't reachable when Linda tried to call through to him. When we were sure that Elvis wasn't in any further distress, I went downstairs to wait for Ghanem. I liked the doctor personally, but I was furious that whatever he was doing to Elvis had reduced him to this state. And when Ghanem finally showed up after a night on the town, I tore into him, questioning him harshly about the therapy. Ghanem insisted he was treating Elvis with placebos, but I didn't believe that placebos could knock him to the floor. I yelled at the doctor until it was pretty obvious that he wasn't going to debate his idea of therapy with me. I left the doctor with these words: "This is a proud man, and I better not see him like this again, or I'll go all the way." The next morning I went back over to the house with Charlie, and I was happy to see that Elvis was feeling well enough to be up on an exercise bicycle in his room. He was also feeling well enough to be angry. He had called out to me when he needed help, but he also hated to be found in that undignified situation. And he did not appreciate my criticism of Dr. Ghanem. He pedaled a little harder, looked over at Charlie, and said, "God damn it, when you guys get your medical degrees, you can tell my doctors what to do." He went on and on about how unqualified we were to judge his condition, but it was always directed toward poor Charlie. Elvis was obviously aware that I had a temper too, and he didn't want to get into a face-to-face confrontation. A couple of hours later, when he had calmed down, I felt I could talk to him, but I was still very conscious of how vulnerable Elvis was at this moment, and I didn't want to say anything that would embarrass him. I simply tried to put across my viewpoint as tactfully as possible. After a month's worth of treatment with Ghanem, Elvis wasn't in the shape he wanted to be in. When he had been under Dr. Nick's care in the hospital, he'd come out feeling strong and healthy. I suggested that he get back with Dr. Nick again. Elvis, a guy who never had a problem spending money, shot back, "He's too damn expensive." But a few hours later, we were out of Ghanem's house and on a plane to Memphis. Elvis got comfortable at Graceland, where, this year, the holiday season was going to be very quiet. I wasn't sure how well my words at Dr. Gunham's had sunk in, but I knew better than to push the matter. Elvis had grown up vulnerable, poor, and unaccepted. As an artist, he was willing to make himself vulnerable on stage. Off stage, he wanted to be the guy who took care of everybody else's problem. It was almost impossible for him to admit that he had a problem. I always wanted to speak the truth to him, but I was usually careful to speak it in a way that he would actually hear and just possibly accept. I'd said all I could say at Gunham's. So as Elvis settled in for quiet holidays with Linda and family, I headed off to New Jersey to spend them with Myrna and her family. Myrna lived in a poor neighborhood in Newark. Members of the Elvis circle teased me that I was probably the only white guy who headed to the ghetto for a vacation. She lived in an old 3-story wood frame house in the city with her grandmother, mother, and brother, all of whom helped her raise her son from a previous marriage. Elvis was particularly fond of her son and made him the only recipient of a specially designed kids' TCB. Myrna had an apartment up in the attic of the house, a cool, bright, comfortable place that she'd fixed up beautifully. It would have been a wonderful creative oasis in any town. And as we spent time together up there, we took advantage of the chance to open up a little further with each other, and I really got a sense of just what a creative talent Myrna was. Her vocal abilities were obvious, but she was also a fine songwriter, lyricist, and poet. She'd even written a play that had been performed in town. I had fallen in love with a beautiful singer. Now I was finding out there was a lot more to love about her. Myrna's family was very accepting of me, and I found myself having some great conversations with her brother, John T., a smart, talented athlete who was working as a school teacher and a karate instructor. I think maybe the only thing close to an awkward moment during the trip came when he and I went out for a drive around town. I'd made it out of North Memphis. I'd survived showing up in New York City without $1 in my pocket. I'd been at ease both in the Oval Office and the humble Hawaiian fishing village where I had courted Sandy. So, as out of place as I was, I can say that it didn't even dawn on me to feel scared of the surroundings in Newark. Parts of town were run down, the neighborhood around Myrna's place was obviously pretty rough, and I didn't see any other white faces around. But I guess I just didn't know enough about what went on to feel threatened. John T. and I went out for a drive and decided we were going to pick up some White Castle hamburgers, the famously small burgers very similar to the Crystal burgers that Elvis and I enjoyed in Memphis. We parked the car, and I started to get out to head into the busy White Castle. John T. looked stricken. I suppose I should point out that at the time I was wearing my winter coat, a white rabbit fur jacket, not something I'd ever put on again, but it seemed pretty cool at the time. "You can't go in there." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I thought we were getting burgers." He just shook his head, and probably got ready to put some of his karate to use. We went into the White Castle. I think we had to step over a few drunk guys to get in, and though we turned a few heads, nothing happened. We got our bag of burgers. If anybody in there was looking for trouble, I guess they figured a white guy in white rabbit fur buying burgers in that part of town was just too crazy to be worth messing with. At the end of January 1975, Elvis took the step I'd been hoping for and checked himself back into Baptist Memorial Hospital. There was some fallout from this decision. For one, an engagement at the Hilton had to be postponed. Also, work on the karate film was halted and the production office was shut down. We had a great rough cut put together, but without the Colonel's support and with Elvis's health now our primary concern, the film couldn't move forward. It was sad to see the project lose momentum, but it was more important for Elvis to get well. Tests were done on his liver once more, and his chronic intestinal problems were monitored. Once more we treated the floor of the hospital like a Vegas suite, setting up Elvis's room the way he wanted it, which again included a bed for Linda. And once again, Sonny and I took turns sleeping in a room across the hall. After the first few days, Elvis was doing great, and was no longer confined to bed. It wasn't unusual to have him stroll into my hospital room as if I were the patient and he were the visitor. The threats to Elvis's health were serious, but we shared one good laugh early in his stay when I noted the names of a couple of the staff that would be taking care of him. Nurse Marion Cock and Nurse Kathy Seaman. Cock and Seaman? I remarked. Elvis, what kind of hospital is this? As Elvis laughed, Nurse Cock herself walked very calmly across the room, got a pitcher of ice water, and poured it down my shirt. Elvis laughed even harder. That was the beginning of a friendship between him and Marion Cock. She'd later become his personal nurse at Graceland. After a few days, some of the new guys moved into the extra hospital room, and Sonny and I left to stay at Graceland. Elvis wanted to get off his medications, but he wasn't happy about eating hospital food, so each day one of the guys, usually Al Strata, would bring a meal the Graceland cooks had put together. Typically meatloaf, cornbread, and greens. Clean pajamas, favorite books, and anything else Elvis wanted in his hospital room would also be delivered. One day, Aunt Delta told me that Elvis's food was ready, but that Sonny, who had offered to make the delivery that day, was still sleeping. I said I didn't have any trouble making the run, since I was going over to the hospital anyway. In the kitchen, I picked up the big brown bag that held food containers and some pajamas. On top of all that was a small box that had come through the mail for Elvis. It had no return address, but was postmarked Las Vegas. What's this? I asked Delta. I don't know. I just thought Elvis might want it, she answered. Sonny was just getting up, and I showed him the box and asked if he knew what it was. He didn't. He and I figured the best thing to do was open it up. Elvis's standing order was to open any suspicious packages. I opened it and found at the center of a lot of packing one large vial of pills. This was an upsetting discovery, and I had the awful feeling of being in the middle of a no-win situation. But I didn't want to just turn this stuff over to Elvis if it was part of the problem. Instead of heading straight to the hospital, I took the pills over to Dr. Nick's office in Midtown and told him how I'd found them. Dr. Nick said that maybe we should give whoever had sent them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe a doctor was helping treat Elvis with some kind of placebo. He sent his head nurse, Tish Hensley, out to have the pills tested. I waited in Dr. Nick's office for a while as he saw some patients. Elvis's meatloaf was getting cold, but this was a more important concern. After a while, the nurse came back with the results. The pills were not a placebo of any kind. They were a powerful narcotic. Anger and frustration flashed across Dr. Nick's face. Elvis is doing fine right now, he said, but I can't get help from any of these other doctors. I wasn't sure what to do next, but Dr. Nick had an idea how to handle the situation. Look, Jerry, Elvis is in a good place emotionally. Take the package to him just like it is. He may handle this well. I got over to the hospital and made it up to the room. Vernon and a couple of the guys were there talking with Elvis, who was in bed. I made the food delivery and showed Elvis the small opened package. I didn't know what might be in here, so I opened it up. He knew exactly what I was showing him and quickly spoke to his father and the others. Would everybody excuse Jerry and me for a moment? I got nervous, thinking maybe he was going to explode at me. But when the others were gone, he stayed perfectly calm and smiled. It's okay, Jerry. I just didn't want to embarrass my daddy. He has a prostate problem, and that's just some medicine I got for him. Go ahead and put it in the medicine cabinet in the bathroom. From what Nick had said, this was obviously not any kind of prostate medicine. I was worried about leaving the pills there and checked back with the doctor as soon as I could. Dr. Nick pointed out that he was in the room at least twice a day and he knew where the pills were and how many were in the vial. If he suspected Elvis had used any, he would confront him. But days went by and the pills remained untouched. Finally, at one checkup, Dr. Nick pulled the vial from the cabinet and asked Elvis where this medicine had come from. I don't know, said Elvis. Whoever was here before me must have left it there. Maybe I should just flush them, said Dr. Nick. Yeah, good idea, said Elvis. The pills were disposed of. The incident points to what Elvis was up against. Even while he was in the hospital trying to overcome the problem, he was being sent opiates as a kind of twisted token of esteem. We never did figure out who sent the pills. Elvis had dealt with many doctors during his stays in Las Vegas. A lot of us close to Elvis wanted to do everything we could to get him well, but there were too many doctors happy to write prescriptions just so they could have some connection to Elvis Presley. He did get healthier during the second hospital stay and was days away from being discharged when another Presley had to be checked in. Elvis called me one afternoon from the hospital. "Jerry, I'm worried about my daddy. He's not feeling good. Would you go by and pick him up, get him over to the hospital?" I headed over to the house behind Graceland, where Vernon now lived with Sandy Miller. Sandy, a former nurse, had called Elvis at the hospital to let him know that Vernon needed medical attention. When I walked in, Vernon was white as a ghost and obviously in tremendous pain. Sandy hadn't wanted to alarm him, but she told me how serious she thought the situation was. I spoke to Vernon. "Mr. Presley, I don't think we should wait for an ambulance." "I don't think so either, Jerry," he whispered. I found myself making the same speedy drive to the hospital that I had when Priscilla went into labor with Lisa Marie. But now there was an expressway to use, and on that road we caught a break. Just as I got on the highway, I was able to get behind an ambulance with its lights on and siren blaring. I stayed behind the ambulance all the way to the hospital, where the doctors told us that Vernon had suffered a major heart attack. We had gotten him there just in time. Once he was out of intensive care, Vernon was checked into the room next to Elvis. And I think Vernon's situation may have helped Elvis. It gave Elvis a chance to be a strong, steady caregiver, rather than just a patient. And it made clear to him and to all of us just how quickly the things we counted on in life might be taken away. Out of the hospital, Elvis's spirit and energy improved a great deal. In Los Angeles, he got ready for some recording sessions and prepared for his rescheduled Vegas gig. There was one particular night that proved to me his crazy sense of humor was still intact. Through Tom Hewlett, I'd become friendly with Richard Cole, who had begun his career working with The Who and the Yardbirds, and had gone on to become the tour manager for Led Zeppelin. Richard was a brash character who also happened to be brilliant at what he did. Elvis had met some of the members of Zeppelin, Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, and John Bonham, before a show at the Los Angeles Forum in 1974, but the group's bassist, John Paul Jones, had never met Elvis personally, and wanted to try to set up a meeting while the group was coming through Southern California on tour. Richard got in touch with me and made the request. Richard had been treating me very well. I'd attended a number of Zeppelin shows with him, riding in his limo and sticking around for the champagne and partying afterward. I felt I owed him something, so I said I'd check with Elvis. Elvis said it would be all right for them to come by the Montevideo house. I was there on the night of the planned meeting and was a little surprised to see that Elvis was in pajamas and robe. He and Sheila Ryan were getting ready to go upstairs. I reminded him that Richard and John were coming by and that all he had to do was stick around to say hello. "If they're waiting on me, they're backing up," he grumbled. He didn't look happy about the prospect of visitors, but he stayed downstairs. Richard and John showed up a little later, and things did not get off to a good start. The band had played a show in San Diego that night, and Richard, who was actually more eccentric than any of the band members, was pumped up with post-show energy. From the moment he stepped into the house, he was loud and profane, packing an amazing number of F-words into everything he said. "You know," Elvis said to him, "I'd appreciate it if you'd watch your language in front of my lady." Things got very quiet. Everybody sat down, and it stayed quiet. Then Elvis decided to break the ice and asked if he could see the fancy watch that Richard was wearing. Richard handed the watch over, and when Elvis put it on, Richard quickly said that if Elvis wanted the watch, he could keep it. "Does it have any special meaning to you?" Elvis asked. "Well, a bit. Atlantic Records gave them to the group," said Richard. "Okay, thanks," said Elvis. I don't know if Richard expected to lose his watch that easily, but about 20 minutes later, Elvis went upstairs and came back down with another watch, a real piece of jewelry covered in diamonds, a wristwatch you could trade in for a car, maybe a couple of cars. "Here," he said to Richard. "Take this one." A very stunned Richard accepted. From then on, the night was nothing but fun, with a lot of laughs and a lot of quoting Monty Python routines. Elvis was the first Monty Python fanatic I ever knew. Elvis and Richard obviously shared a sense of humor, and I could tell Elvis also liked the much quieter John. At one point, Elvis excused himself, went back upstairs, and returned with an equally impressive watch for the bassist. Before the evening was over, Elvis said he wanted to make another exchange. He was out of watches, but had another bit of fashion in mind. So he stood, eyed John, and said, "Let's swap pants," while simultaneously, in expert Python fashion, letting his pajama bottoms drop beneath his robe. The loud Richard was shocked into silence, while quiet Sheila and John burst out laughing. Nobody accepted Elvis's offer, but it was a great note to end the night on. At the end of a previous Hilton engagement, a group of us had gone with Elvis to see a Barbra Streisand concert at one of the other hotels. We went backstage after the show, and I was standing with Elvis when Barbara asked him what he thought of what he'd seen. He told her that it was a great show and a great performance, but that she did too much with her hands. Her gestures sometimes covered her face and distracted from her voice. Maybe it was meant as some helpful performer-to-performer advice, but I assumed that was the last time we'd ever see Barbra Streisand. It wasn't. On the next to last night of the March 75 Hilton run, during the midnight show, the maitre d' informed us that Barbara was in the audience and wanted to come backstage after the show to see Elvis. She was with her boyfriend, John Peters, who had previously been her hairstylist, and the two indicated that they had something serious to discuss with Elvis. People were coming and going from Elvis's dressing room, so for some privacy, Elvis, Joe, Barbara, John, and I all moved into the room's walk-in closet and sat on the floor there. Barbara began to pitch Elvis. Streisand had become a film star with roles in movies such as Funny Girl, Hello Dolly, and What's Up Doc, and she'd become a true Hollywood power after the success of The Way We Were in 1973. Now she was looking to executive produce her own film in which she'd also star, and she had a project in mind. She wanted to redo the dramatic Hollywood tale A Star is Born. The film had been originally made in 1937, starring Janet Gaynor, and again in 1954, starring Judy Garland. The film's female lead character climbs the slippery ladder of Hollywood success while her husband, a former star, sees his career head in the other direction and proceeds to drink himself into oblivion. In the original, the husband's character, Norman Maine, had been played by Frederick March, and in the Garland version, it was played by James Mason. For Streisand's version, the story would be set in the world of rock and roll rather than in Hollywood. And when Streisand stepped into the lead role, she wanted Elvis as her Norman Maine. When we all first sat and Barbara started talking, Elvis was simply attentive and courteous, willing to hear out whatever she had to say. But as he got a hold of what she was offering him, he got very excited. So many years earlier, when Elvis was making all those films for producer Hal Wallace at Paramount, he screened a movie at the Memphian one night that he fell in love with, Beckett, starring Richard Burton. That film was also produced by Hal Wallace. In between Wallace's work on the Elvis films Fun in Acapulco and Roustabout, Elvis realized that the profits of all his little, unimportant films were what allowed Wallace and the studio to make an artistic picture like the Burton film. So the next time Elvis was on a set, he approached the producer and asked, "Mr. Wallace, when do I get my Beckett?" He never got an answer. But here was his shot. A top star and proven film talent understood what Elvis was capable of as an actor, and she was offering him the role of a lifetime. He and Streisand talked about the old films, how things would change in the new film, other ideas for casting, ideas for particular scenes. Elvis was thrilled with the character of Norman. For once, he would not have to play the attractive nice guy. He'd be playing a textured, tragic character. Food was ordered and brought into the closet so that the talk could continue uninterrupted. and I almost choked with surprise on whatever I was eating when I heard Elvis make the comparison he had dismissed just months before. "You know," he said, "this could be like From Here to Eternity for me." The only catch was Streisand's choice of producer. She wanted Peters, a completely unproven talent, to handle the role. She assured Elvis that Peters had the vision and skills for the job and said she now had enough weight with the studios to insist on his participation. Elvis had never been much of a meeting guy, but sitting in that closet, he had one of the most focused, constructive meetings of his life. By the time we were saying goodbye to Streisand and Peters, Elvis's eyes were just about blazing with the excitement of this new opportunity. Once they'd gone, Elvis, Joe, and I hung out in the dressing room, where Sonny and Red were still on security duty. Elvis let them know what he'd been offered and how good it sounded to him. I was truly thrilled for him. But I had just seen another dream, our karate film, fall apart largely because the Colonel had been allowed to undermine the project at a time when Elvis wasn't well enough to fight for it. In all their years together, the Colonel never directly told Elvis he couldn't do something, and whenever Elvis really stood up to the Colonel, Elvis won. But the Colonel could win a slow war, making a simple demand look so complicated that eventually Elvis didn't see any upside in the fight. It had happened with the karate film. It had happened with the overseas touring. I didn't want it to happen this time. If Elvis thought this Streisand film was worth fighting for, I wanted him to be ready for the fight. "You know, Elvis, the problem with this is that this guy Peters hasn't produced anything before." "Well, that's not a problem. Barbara and I are going to do what we're going to do anyway." "Well, that's what I'm afraid of," I heard myself saying. That line changed the mood of the night. Elvis got very angry. He was angry at me, but I think he was also angry because he, too, knew what kind of battle was coming. In that little closet, anything seemed possible. But once Elvis left the dressing room and brought this opportunity out into the light of day, he was going to run into the same old resistance from the Colonel. Elvis knew it better than I did. My comments just made that reality set in a little faster. And when I think back to that night, it's the one time I wish I could take back something I said to Elvis and do it over. I wanted to support him. In my heart, I did support him. This was a fight I wanted him to win. But it didn't happen. The Colonel was predictably outraged that deal-making had been done behind his back, in a dressing-room closet of all places. He was not happy about people getting to Elvis without going through him. As a manager, this was an understandable concern that came not only from self-interest, but also from his responsibility to protect his client. But this was a case of a top talent approaching another top talent. They didn't need to be protected from each other. They wanted to do something powerful and creative together. The Colonel's old-school sensibility didn't give much weight to the creative, though. Aside from Elvis, talent was talent, a deal was a deal, and there was a right way for business to be done. Over the following weeks, the Colonel played some of the toughest hardball of his career. He insisted that Elvis could not participate in the film unless he was billed over Streisand, and demanded double what was being offered as Elvis's fee, plus half of all the film's back-end profits and all kinds of creative approval. Streisand's people tried to negotiate in good faith, but eventually had no choice but to give up. When the film came out the following year, it won an Oscar for Best Original Song and picked up 3 other Oscar nominations. Chris Christopherson won a Best Actor Golden Globe for his portrayal of Norman Maine. This was the last time Elvis let himself fill with hope about a chance to stretch artistically. When that hope curdled, Elvis knew he was never going to get his Beckett. And after this incident, one of the saddest truths of Elvis's career was crystal clear to me. The pills he took were only Band-Aids. What was sucking the life out of Elvis Presley was creative disappointment. Chapter 14. Good Luck Emerald. "Who the hell's limousine is that?" I think it's probably Eric's, E. Who's Eric? Eric Clapton? You said he could come by to say hello, remember? Yeah, that's okay. Just don't need the damn limousine parked in front of the theater. Elvis didn't normally have anything against limousines, but at the moment he was at the wheel of a pickup truck, wearing boots and cowboy hat and feeling a little more down home than usual. After a spring and summer of heavy touring, Elvis was back in Memphis for a while, and Myrna and I were back there with him. We had gone for a ride down across the Mississippi state line so that Elvis could show Myrna some of the old Circle G ranch land, and we headed back up to the General Cinema to screen a movie at midnight. Jaws, Godfather II, and especially Monty Python and the Holy Grail were Elvis' favorites at the time. About a week before, I was at Graceland when I received another call from Richard Cole. This time he was on tour with Clapton, who had become a huge American concert draw with his #1 hit, I Shot the Sheriff. Eric had a big show scheduled at the Liberty Bowl in Memphis and was going to come to town a day early if he could meet Elvis. There had been less and less entertaining at the house over the last few years, and I knew Elvis would not want to have somebody visit him there. We'd been going to the movies a lot, though, and I thought maybe Eric could say hello to Elvis at the theater. But the theater was also a place where Elvis wanted some privacy, and he didn't like the look of that great big limo in front of the place. I worried for a moment that the sight of the car might darken Elvis's mood and sour the meeting with the guitarist. But when I introduced the two inside, Clapton was the perfect British gentleman, and it was clear from the start how much respect he had for Elvis. Elvis became a relaxed and charming host, and he and Clapton fell right into a friendly conversation. The more they talked, the more Clapton looked like he was having a life's dream come true. And it struck me again how much Elvis meant, not just to his audience, but to fellow musicians. For some time it hadn't been unusual for Elvis's records and concerts to be treated harshly by the press. His own ambitions and desires for his career were being left unfulfilled. But here was Clapton, a superstar still on the rise, wanting nothing more than a chance to talk with Elvis. The two got along well enough that Elvis asked Eric and his girlfriend Patty, George Harrison's ex-wife, to stay and watch that night's movie. The couple gladly accepted the invitation. As everybody took their seats, Elvis asked me to come with him to the bathroom. "You know, Jerry," he said to me when we were alone, "that Eric is all right." The next morning I heard from Richard Cole again. Eric wanted Myrna and me to be his guests at the concert, and would come by in his limo to pick us up before the show. Most times, if you introduced someone to Elvis, they sort of forgot about whoever it was that made the connection for them, which was to be expected. But Eric was gracious and thoughtful enough to want to return the favor I'd done for him. He came by early in the afternoon, and we had a chance to get to know him a little better on the ride to the stadium. Once we got to the Liberty Bowl's backstage area, Myrna and I received all our passes and credentials, and when Eric went off to get ready for the show, Myrna and I decided to go out into the stadium itself, just to soak up the atmosphere. Elvis played some big arenas, but they were always indoor shows. I was fascinated by the different feel of a daylight outdoor concert setup, and took some mental notes about how the whole event was put together. When it seemed like it was about time for the show to start, we started to head backstage again, and ran into trouble. A huge Memphis policeman manning the backstage access said we couldn't come through. I showed him our VIP passes, but that didn't seem to make a difference. He just told us again he wouldn't let us through. I told him we'd come to the show in Eric Clapton's limousine, but he still wouldn't let us through. Then I realized what the problem was. It was obvious that Myrna and I were a couple, a white man and a black woman. That was the problem. For a moment I was completely at a loss. Myrna and I had been together in cities all over the country and hadn't had any trouble. We'd been in Memphis many times before and hadn't had any trouble. But this time, back in my hometown, I could feel it. This big policeman hated us on sight. I could tell by the way he looked at us. I'd grown up seeing that look, but I'd never been on the receiving end of that look before. "Hey, Jerry, how's it going?" Behind us was a Memphis police captain I'd gotten friendly with when he helped set up security details for Elvis. The captain understood exactly what was going on. Our laminates may not have meant anything to the big policeman in front of us, but he wasn't going to hassle us if his superior officer knew me well enough to say hello. He stepped aside and we walked through. The show was great, and we heard some of the finest guitar playing we'd ever witnessed. We didn't let the isolated, ugly encounter at the gate ruin our day, but it did strike me as a little ironic that because I had an in with the police captain, I got to listen to Eric Clapton sing "I Shot the Sheriff." I never got the opportunity to co-executive produce the karate film to completion, but by the middle of 1975 another career opportunity had presented itself to me. The Sweet Inspirations were spending most of their time working with Elvis, but they also had a career of their own. Before joining Elvis, they were one of the most in-demand studio vocal groups in the business, working with everyone from Wilson Pickett to Van Morrison, and in 1968 they'd had a top 20 single of their own titled Sweet Inspiration. Now they performed under their own billing as an opening act at Elvis shows and sometimes made their own appearances. They also recorded and performed with Aretha Franklin, and were just finishing their own David Porter-produced album for the Stax label. They had tremendous past credits and a very promising future. What they didn't have was a manager. I had never managed, but being so close to Elvis and the Colonel for so many years was really a kind of master class in the do's and don'ts of the manager-artist relationship. I'd been spending nights listening to Elvis pour his heart out about his creative frustrations, and during the day I was watching the Colonel take care of the business end of things. From those two experiences, I'd already developed a management philosophy. Business concerns could not trump creativity, and creativity couldn't completely disregard business concerns. The two had to overlap at least a little bit to move an artist's career forward. But if the management side and the creative side couldn't communicate, a career could be destroyed. Myrna had been handling business for the group and doing a good job of it, but Sylvia and Estelle suggested bringing me on as manager, and Myrna agreed that it was a good idea. I liked the idea of doing work that would keep me close to Elvis as a friend, but would give me some satisfaction of having my own career. What I suggested to the group was this. Since they'd already worked out all their deals with Elvis, I wouldn't have anything to do with that side of their business, and obviously wouldn't take the usual manager's cut of whatever money they made through those deals. I'd earn money only on deals made as we moved forward. I was still an Elvis guy, but the Sweet Inspirations became the first act signed to a brand new company, Jerry Schilling Management. There were nights on the road when Elvis was still every bit the master entertainer, but there were other times when you could sense just how tired he'd become of night after night of one-night stands, and when you could see what a toll it had taken on him. His stage jumpsuits had originally been designed to accommodate his intensely physical performances. The way he moved on stage, he'd rip regular clothing to shreds. But now his jumpsuits were designed to mask his heavier frame. As he got bigger, so did the cut of the suits and the size of the belts he wore. We guys had once jokingly had an over 200 club. Membership was based on our ability to work up a belly when we were back in Memphis between films. Now there wasn't anything funny about Elvis's battle to keep himself in shape. Though his big hopes for his movie career had been crushed with the fizzling of A Star is Born, in the fall of 1975 he made a move that showed he still wanted to change the routine. He bought a plane. To be exact, he bought an out-of-service Convair 880 jet that had previously belonged to Delta Airlines, but this wasn't just an impulse purchase of some sort of ultimate flying Cadillac. Elvis thought that if he had his own plane with his own crew, he had a better chance of making that overseas tour happen. I know that's what he was thinking, because before that Convair was purchased, Vernon and I had made a trip to New Jersey to look at an available Boeing 707. The plane was in great mechanical shape and had already been customized to include personal quarters, a meeting area, and even a dance floor. But the previous owner had been Robert Vesco, the fugitive financier who had fled to South America after allegedly embezzling hundreds of millions of dollars from international investment firms. Buying his plane would involve some complicated wrangling with the IRS, and Elvis was warned about another complication. If the plane ever landed in any of the countries Vesco was establishing a base in, there was every reason to believe that he might try to seize it. On the other hand, the Convair had a clean record and would have no problem flying to any country around the globe. So that's the plane Elvis purchased. He immediately rechristened it the Lisa Marie. The plane was in a hangar at Meacham Field in Fort Worth, and for months Elvis took great pleasure in flying friends, including Priscilla, out to Texas to check on progress as the interior of the plane was refurbished to his very specific design requirements. He bought another plane to make those trips, a smaller Lockheed Jetstar. Elvis wanted a seating area, a conference room, and a private bedroom on the plane, with space for an in-flight reading library. He picked fabrics, decided on color schemes, chose the onboard audio-visual system, and even okayed the gold fixtures in the bathrooms. He counted heavily on some aesthetic input from Priscilla, too. He was especially excited about the fact that the same design team working on the Lisa Marie had previously customized Air Force One. Every trip out, he'd proudly walk a group of us through the plane, and he'd take Polaroid pictures so he could check the progress of the renovation. The craft slowly came together as an airworthy mix of modern function and Graceland elegance. When the final paint job was applied to the exterior, there was a prominent TCB logo on the tail. The Christmas season in 1975 was not the usual family event at Graceland. Priscilla and Lisa Marie were in Los Angeles. Myrna had gone back to Newark. On Christmas Eve, Elvis and I were sitting alone up in his bedroom, while a mix of friends and visitors waited down in the living room. I could see that he just didn't have any excitement for the occasion. I really don't want to go down there this year." "Well, then don't, E. You don't have to." It would be the first time Elvis didn't make an appearance downstairs to at least go through the routine of a gift exchange with the guys. He was simply not feeling in much of a Christmas mood and didn't want to deal with a holiday party. So we just sat and talked for a while. Around 10 o'clock, he said, "I want to get something for Grandma. Why don't you call Harry Levitch and see if he can come up?" Harry, Elvis's longtime Memphis jeweler, was used to being on call for Elvis's holiday purchases, and he arrived at the house shortly with a wide selection of items. Elvis picked out something for his grandma, then decided he'd get something for Vernon, too, picking out a ring for his father. I made out the check for Harry, and then Elvis had a private moment with the jeweler to thank him. After Levitch left, Elvis and I were alone again. Elvis sat down on the edge of his bed and said, "I want to read you something, Jerry." He picked up his well-worn copy of Cairo's Book of Numbers. Over the last couple of years, he had returned to his interest in all forms of spirituality. He was reading The Impersonal Life and Autobiography of a Yogi again. He'd been in touch with Dayamata at the Self-Realization Fellowship. He had even, much to the Colonel's dismay, resumed a friendship with Larry Geller, who was now often on the road with us. With a favorite work like the Book of Numbers, Elvis didn't just read it once or twice and move on. If the work grabbed his imagination, he went back to it again and again, scribbling notes to himself on the pages and marking off significant passages. Now he flipped open the book to a page he'd marked. "You're in number 6, Jerry. You know what that means?" "Oh, no, E." He began reading. "They are very determined in carrying out their plans, and may in fact be deemed obstinate and unyielding, except when they themselves become deeply attached. In such a case they become devoted to those they love. When roused by anger, they will brook no opposition, and will fight to the death for whatever person or cause they espouse. But the number 6 people have got the power of making more friends than almost any other class, and they lean to the romantic and ideal in all matters of affection." "That sound like you, Jerry?" "That's dead on," I laughed. "There's one more thing. It says that number 6 should always have an emerald close to his skin for good luck." He closed the book, laid it on the bed, and reached into his pocket. He produced a beautifully detailed ring with a carved emerald set in it. He reached out, took my hand, and slid the ring on. "I want you to have plenty of good luck, Jerry." I thanked him, but it hardly seemed enough. Even when I was so worried about him, he was still giving so much to me. "What does it say about your number, E?" He picked the book back up and flipped it open. He began reading. "Number 8s have deep and very intense natures, great strength of individuality. They generally play some important role on life's stage, but usually one which is fatalistic or as the instrument of fate for others. They often appear cold and undemonstrative, though in reality they have warm hearts towards the oppressed of all classes, but they hide their feelings and allow people to think just what they please. All persons who have the number 8 clearly associated with their lives feel that they are distinct and different from their fellows. At heart they are lonely, they are misunderstood, and they seldom reap the reward for the good they may do while they are living. After their death they are often extolled, their works praised, and lasting tributes offered to their memory." He put the book back down. We sat quietly for a moment. He smiled a bit. "Merry Christmas, 6. "Merry Christmas, 8, I answered. Elvis had always taken a break from performing during the weeks between Christmas and his birthday, but this year the Colonel squeezed in a New Year's Eve show at the huge Silverdome in Pontiac, Michigan. The show drew a huge crowd and was a financial success, but it was not a good experience for Elvis. The freezing weather had everyone shivering through the night, and the situation was made worse by a 2-tiered stage setup that had Elvis separated from the band. At showtime, Joe, Dick Grobe, and I walked Elvis to the upper platform of the stage, and I could tell right away that he was very uncomfortable. The spontaneity of his shows depended on direct contact with the band, and up here that would be impossible. He met the challenge and put out a great effort that night, but the sound system in the domed stadium functioned so poorly that at midnight many of the 60,000 fans turned their attention from the stage and treated the event as their own large-scale New Year's Eve party. Elvis was extremely agitated about the show afterward and thought it was a lousy way to start the year. But in Memphis, a couple of days later, he came up with an idea that he thought would get the year started right: a big group vacation ski trip to Vail, Colorado. The impulse was wonderful, but the vacation was far from relaxing. After a 2-week December run at the Hilton, the not-so-festive Christmas, the New Year's in Michigan, and a quick flight back to Memphis, the group around Elvis was feeling a little ragged. Whipping together a ski vacation on the spur of the moment felt more like work than time off, especially since our group of Memphis boys didn't have a single skier in it. And there were some tensions and differences emerging between the older guys and the newer guys, differences that mainly centered on whether you considered Elvis a friend who was also your employer, or whether you simply considered him an unpredictable boss. The Memphis Mafia had once prided itself on our us-against-the-world spirit, but now the differences in lifestyle and attitude among us made it increasingly harder to pull together as a group. We flew out of Memphis, Elvis and Linda Thompson, Myrna and myself, Joe and girlfriend Shirley Deer, Billy Smith, Sonny and Red, Lamar, Dean Nicopolis, Al Strada, and several others. As it was already the height of the holiday season, we all holed up in a Denver hotel, while Joe Esposito took on the almost impossible task of lining up accommodations. We needed a house for Elvis and condos for everybody else. Not so surprisingly, Joe got the job done. In Vail, Elvis settled into a large house right by one of the ski lifts. After 3 days in a hotel, he wanted to get out on the slopes that night and have some fun, and we all joined him. But it looked to me that the work of getting the arrangements together had exhausted Joe. The last thing he was interested in was night skiing. He stayed in to catch up on sleep. One of the first full days in Vail was January 8, Elvis's 41st birthday. But Elvis let it be known he didn't want to celebrate it at all. That seemed to be fine by everyone else. We all split up and settled into our own separate condos. But that night, Linda called over to my place. Elvis was feeling down. Did Myrna and I want to come over? We joined Elvis and Linda, and before long it felt like we were all having the kind of vacation fun Elvis had been after. He seemed really pleased to have Myrna and me with him, and we just stayed in and had a simple, friendly celebration. Linda even made a little cake for Elvis. But the evening had, literally, a dramatic ending. We began to talk about favorite movies, and Elvis asked Myrna if she'd ever seen one of his recently rediscovered favorites, Across 110th Street, a gritty New York City mafia flick starring Anthony Quinn, Yaphet Kotto, and Tony Franciosa. Myrna hadn't seen it, and so Elvis acted it out for her. I don't mean he told her the story and quoted a few lines of dialogue. He began to act out the whole movie, setting up each scene and then presenting just about every line of dialogue in the script. He brought each character to life with walks, vocal mannerisms, and the subtlest of gestures. It was a bravura performance, and Elvis drew upon that photographic memory of his, the talent for voices that had always made his Dr. Strangelove and Monty Python reenactments so funny, and the intense physical movements of his stage performances. Elvis loved 110th Street's story of mob betrayal and revenge, but he was also taken with smaller elements of the film, the kind of perfect details he was so good at focusing on. Tony Franciosa had a way of stroking his chin in a subtly menacing fashion. Elvis had the move down cold. And Yaphet Kotto barely raised his rumble of a voice above a whisper in the film, which Elvis perfectly mimicked. It was great to see him up and excited, and a thrill to be his private audience. Linda, Myrna, and I would have been happy to just sit and talk with Elvis, the way the evening had started. But Elvis didn't stop until he got to the final scene of the film, which took us into the very early hours of the morning. I'd seen the film with him 2 or 3 times in Memphis, but I had to admit, this was the version I enjoyed the most. Everybody started to have a good time over the next week. Guys, wives, and girlfriends did get out on the slopes, and though Elvis never put skis on, he insisted that everybody else take lessons. At the end of the day, when the slopes were closed to the public, Elvis would appear, bundled up in his snow gear, and we'd go snowmobiling or ride inner tubes down the bottom of the runs. There were times when the fun seemed a little forced, and there were times when the fun got dangerous. Riding inner tubes down dark sections of the slopes was an easy way to get hurt, and one night we had to take Dean Nicopolis to the emergency room with a broken foot. We took some forbidden nighttime snowmobile runs across the slopes, and one night Lamar, taking an uncharted path through the woods, rode his snowmobile over the deep, soft snow that had piled over a building foundation. He sunk down well over his head and probably would have been there until the spring thaw if Elvis hadn't found him and pulled him out. Off the slopes, Elvis spent a lot of time with Ron Petrofesso and Jerry Kennedy, Denver policemen he had met on past trips to the city. They had always been supportive of Elvis, even welcoming him into their own inner circle of police officers. And during this trip, Elvis bought them Cadillacs as thank-you gifts. After 2 weeks in Vail, we were all thoroughly exhausted. I think everybody needed a vacation from our vacation, and probably more importantly, needed some private time before our next tour began in March. Lack of sleep had become a terrible problem for Elvis. As much as his body needed rest, he just couldn't get it, and he was often in a state of almost manic energy. Trying to keep up with him put a lot of pressure on an already fractured group. The physical activity of the ski trip hadn't seemed to do anything to diminish Elvis's restlessness, and the fact that his vacation idea had actually worked out pretty well didn't seem to give him any satisfaction. If 2 weeks in Vail was good, wouldn't a few more days be better? Elvis wanted arrangements made so that we could all continue to stay on the slopes. The rentals that Joe had worked out were up, and Joe himself had already headed back to California with Shirley. Myrna had also left, flying back home to Newark. Elvis wanted me to take on the job of finding a whole new round of condos for the group. Now, I was the one who had to stay up for a day and a half, doing everything I could to get some available condos to materialize, and figuring out who would go where and how everybody would be moved around. Somehow I got it done, and the arrangements were made. I'd found a house for Elvis and had extended the rental period on one of the nicer condos that he had also been using. He and Linda had been switching between the house by the lift and this condo. The place I'd been staying at with Myrna was gone, so I moved my stuff to Elvis's condo and went to sleep in the master suite. The phone rang at 3 in the morning. It was Billy Smith. He told me that Elvis was coming over. Elvis wanted to move from his house to his condo, and he wanted me to move out of the condo to the house. I couldn't imagine why we had to make this switch at 3 in the morning, and I was tired enough that I didn't really feel like moving anywhere. The condo had the master suite and 2 smaller bedrooms, one of which wasn't much more than a closet. I moved my stuff into the smallest bedroom, figuring I'd be well out of the way if Elvis wanted to take over the master bedroom. I fell asleep again, but was woken up once more by Elvis's voice. "I thought you were asked to move back to the house." I was tired enough to be in a rotten mood. Instead of being shown any appreciation for making the moves happen, I was getting moved around some more. "You've got the suite, Elvis." "Yeah, but I need Red and Billy to stay here." There was an ugly edge in his voice, a dismissive tone, like I was just another one of his problems. He was talking to me as if I were one of the new guys in the group, one of the guys who called him boss. "Damn it, Elvis, I've been up 2 days working all this out. I need to sleep." He didn't answer. He stormed off into the master bedroom, and I heard him yelling with Red. Then he came back to the room I was in, said loudly, "All right," then mumbled, "You could stay." Something ripped inside me. "You know what, E? I don't want to stay here," I shouted. "In fact, I'm leaving. I said you could stay, damn it." I looked at him. He'd been acting like someone I didn't know, but I could also tell he knew he had pushed me too far. I was so tired. Maybe he was tired too. Everybody around us was worn down. It was time to go. "No, E, I'm going to leave. I'm going home." I moved over to the house where Dean Nikopoulos had been staying with Elvis and spent the night there. In the morning I heard the phone ring. Dean came by my room to let me know that Elvis was on the line for me. "Hello? Jerry, how's it coming with those condos?" He wasn't being sarcastic or pretending that nothing had happened. He didn't know anything had happened. The night before was a complete blank to him. "Elvis, I've always said our friendship is more important to me than this job." "What are you talking about?" I didn't want to get into it again, but I told him I was going back to L.A. "Look, Elvis, I just need a change. No hard feelings." He seemed a little surprised, but accepted it. "Well, I guess you have to do what you have to do," he said. Maybe it would have been just as easy for me to pretend that the night before hadn't happened. But it had, and even in the cold light of the morning after, it felt right to follow through on my decision. I didn't see any way to balance our friendship with the way things were working around him now. If I stayed, I felt I'd end up with no choice but to become either a complete yes-man or a pain in the ass. I didn't want to be either one to him. If Elvis and I had any chance of remaining true friends, I had to get out of there.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.